Hi everyone, it's Jigoku-ren. Just finished editing both parts 1 and 2 of The Opening of the Eyes, and I will play them here after I finish with my little introduction, but after I got finished I realized that I might need to record like a little mini podcast just to explain why I did this audiobook and some of the details within the book's contents. So here in America, most people will probably have their first experience with Nichiren Buddhism through an organization like Soka Gakkai International, also known as SGI. And the most widely used translations of Nichiren's works are actually owned by Soka Gakkai and SGI and distributed through their various branches. The problem with this is that they don't really seem intent on recording any audio versions of those translations. They seem to focus a lot more on the books written by their third president, Daisaku Ikeda, despite Nichiren Buddhism supposedly being the primary focus of their organizations. This has prompted me to take it upon myself to record my own audiobook version of The Opening of the Eyes, which I believe to be one of Nichiren's most important works. I've been considering doing this for a while now, and finally, just since I had a little bit of free time this week, buckled down and got it finished. And it took a little more work than I expected, but I'm fairly happy with the end result. One of the things that sets Nichiren's writings apart from the other Japanese Buddhist patriarchs is his style, which is very emotional and personal and very fire and brimstone, I would say. So I wanted to kind of capture that in my delivery and give it a very emotional edge. I'm not sure if everybody will agree that I succeeded in that, but I think I did okay for an amateur. Regarding the actual content of the audiobook, so for this recording, I actually used a physical paperback book that was published by the Nichiren Shoshu International Center back in the 70s. And for people who don't know, the organization Soka Gakkai, which I mentioned earlier, they used to be partnered with Nichiren Shoshu, and a lot of the more official business would have been done through Nichiren Shoshu. So this would have been seen as the more authoritative version back then. In the 90s, Soka Gakkai was actually excommunicated by Nichiren Shoshu for what Shoshu described as divergence with Nichiren Buddhist doctrine. So Soka Gakkai now uses their own proprietary translations. This translation does not seem to have been republished since the 70s, or if it has, it must have been in a very limited manner because it's not something I've come across. A few differences between this version and the one that Soka Gakkai uses. So I very much like the Soka Gakkai versions, but having read this for this audiobook, it seems that Soka Gakkai's version may have been abridged in some ways because this one seems to me to be a bit longer. And that's not too uncommon for Buddhist texts because they tend to repeat certain phrases and certain lists quite often, and this is no exception to that. But I do appreciate having a more extensive translation without taking too many parts out of it. So I do think this may be superior in that manner. However, you will notice that the phrasing can be a little clunky and some of the words are not readily understood by today's general audiences. So it might be more of a difficult read than if you just went and found the more modern Soka Gakkai version. If I were to make my own translation, I would probably put it somewhere in the middle. Maybe do the extensive, more literal translation like this version, but have the wording more modern and streamlined like the Soka Gakkai version. But other than that, I wanted to explain some of the translation choices, which I thought were a bit interesting, maybe problematic for people who aren't very well versed in the subjects discussed in The Opening of the Eyes. For instance, some words are translated into their Japanese versions, whereas some are translated into their Sanskrit versions. One interesting example is the titles of Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha being translated into their Japanese versions, which are Shomon and Engaku. And you will hear those terms repeated quite often in this work. So the Shravakas were, if you can imagine, what people call early Buddhism sometimes, or what's now known as Theravada Buddhism. That is considered what the Mahayana calls Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, but what would be called more conventionally the Shravaka vehicle. Shravaka being a word meaning voice hearer. And so the Shravakas that are discussed in this text were the disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha, who scholars will sometimes call the historical Buddha. Men like Shariputra or Subhuti, who you will hear mentioned in the texts, both in the Pali texts or the suttas and the Mahayana sutras. And then there's the Pratyeka Buddhas, who were beings who had gained kind of a high level of realization or enlightenment without the aid of a teacher. But the problem with them is that they couldn't teach. They weren't like Shakyamuni Buddha in that they could go and spread their doctrines and help other people. They would just come upon enlightenment for themselves and then extinguish their physical forms. So they were considered by the Mahayana to be inferior, along with the Shravakas, at least in a lot of the Mahayana texts, which Nichiren will get into that in this work. He has quite a lot to say in this particular text regarding the Shravakas. There's also the issue of the names of canonical texts, or sutras, as they're called here, which are also translated into their Japanese forms. In the Soka Gakkai version, I believe they use the English names, so they use the direct translation. So you would have like the Benevolent King Sutra, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, or the Great Collection Sutra, kind of names like that. Here they use the Japanese names for them, which is kind of an interesting decision and not really something I've come across in any other English translations. I'm not going to go over the different Japanese names and their respective English or Sanskrit names, but if you're interested in this, you can just Google them and figure those out for yourself. But that's just another thing I thought I should note before I go ahead with the actual audiobook. One last detail I thought I should discuss is Nichiren's attitude towards the other schools of Buddhism, which isn't something that you really see anymore in the modern world. Modern Buddhist schools tend to take a more kind of we're all in this together kind of approach, at least on their face. And that sort of makes sense considering how secular modernity tends to be. However, it was not always like that back in the day, especially in the medieval period. There was a lot of doctrinal dispute, and that kept going for quite a long time. Much of Japan's history is filled with different sectarian disputes and, Buddhist infighting. Even within the sects themselves, you'd have splinter groups and schisms and whatnot. The Tendai school, which was actually the one that Nichiren was originally trained under, and which he makes frequent references to in this work, they're a prime example of this because they had a very serious schism after the passing away of their original patriarch, Saicho, or as Nichiren calls him in this, Dengyo. And the fighting between the two groups was so severe that they would actually constantly burn down each other's temples. So there was one group at the top of the mountain and one at the bottom, and they would just go back and forth, like destroying each other's stuff. And so this was kind of the environment that Nichiren had been, raised in. He entered the priesthood at a very young age and was trained in both esoteric and exoteric doctrine by monks of the Tendai school. However, even with this context provided, I think a lot of people may be surprised at how critical the work is of the other schools, even going so far as to claim that their patriarchs are bound for hell. And this too was not unheard of back then, but this may be kind of the clearest example of that kind of rhetoric in action. And I think people may be off-put by it, but that is also part of the history of Japanese Buddhism and the Nichiren school. And it is important in getting kind of his severity across. He was a very firm believer in the things that he says, and I do believe that he was very skilled in his doctrinal analysis. And as you go through this audiobook, you'll hear a lot of citations. He was very thorough with his research, which is always a plus. And I think this kind of severity, which he demonstrates here, may be one of the reasons why organizations like Soka Gakkai have been a little sheepish around making this stuff more available in, like an audio version. But I can't say for certain. I'm not part of that organization, much less a member of their editorial leadership or anything. But regardless, I hope you find this informative. It was one of the primary texts which gave me a greater understanding of the Lotus Sutra and its relative importance within the greater Mahayana Buddhist framework, and ultimately to faith in the Lotus Sutra as a primary focus of my Buddhism. And I'm hoping that it will have the same effect on other people. Anyway, with all that said, here is Nichiren's The Opening of the Eyes in 2 parts. Enjoy. The Opening of the Eyes by Nichiren Daishonin. Part 1. There are 3 categories of people that all men and women should respect. They are the sovereign, the teacher, and the parent. There are 3 types of doctrines that are to be studied. They are Confucianism, Brahmanism, and Buddhism. Confucianism describes the 3 rulers, the 5 emperors, and the 3 kings, which it calls the heaven-honored ones. These men are depicted as the heads and eyes of the government officials and the pillars and beams of the populace. In the age before the 3 rulers, people lived like animals, and did not even know who their own fathers were. But from the time of the 5 emperors on, they learned to identify their father and mother, and to treat them according to the dictates of filial piety. Thus Shun, the last of the 5 emperors, served his father with reverence, though the latter was stubborn and hard-headed. Also, the governor of Pei, after he became the first emperor of the Han dynasty, continued to pay great respect to his father, the venerable sire. King Wu of the Zhou dynasty made a wooden image of his father, the Earl of the West, and Ting Lan fashioned a statue of his mother. All of these men are models of filial piety. The High Minister Pikan, seeing the Yin dynasty was on the path to ruin, strongly admonished the ruler, though it cost him his head. Hung Yin, finding that his lord, Duke Yi, had been killed, cut open his own stomach and inserted the duke's liver in it before he died. These men may serve as models of loyalty. Yin Shou was the teacher of Emperor Yao. Wu Chang was the teacher of Emperor Shun. Tai Kung Wang was the teacher of King Wen, and Lao Tzu was the teacher of Confucius. These teachers are known as the 4 sages. Even the heaven-honored ones bow their heads to them in respect, and all people press their palms together in reverence. Sages such as these have left behind writings that run to over 3,000 volumes in such works as 3 records, 5 canons, and 3 histories. But all of these writings in the end do not advance beyond the 3 mysteries. The first of the 3 mysteries is being. This is the principle taught by the Duke of Zhou and others. The second mystery is non-being, which was expounded by Lao Tzu. The third is both being and non-being, which is the mystery set forth by Chuang-Tzu. Mystery denotes darkness. Some say that if we ask what existed before our ancestors were born, we will find that life was born out of the primal force, while others declare that immanence and obscurity, joy and sorrow, right and wrong, gain and loss occur simply as part of the natural order. These are theories that are cleverly argued, but which fail to take cognizance of either the past or the future. Mystery, as we have seen, means darkness or obscurity, and it is for this reason that it is called mystery. It is a theory that deals with matters only in terms of the present. Speaking in terms of the present, the Confucians declare that one should abide by the principles of benevolence and righteousness, and thereby ensure safety to oneself and peace and order to the state. If one departs from these principles, they say, then one's family will be doomed and one's house overthrown. But although the wise and worthy men who preach this doctrine are acclaimed as sages, they know nothing more about the past than an ordinary person unable to see his own back, and they understand as little about the future as a blind man who cannot see what lies in front of him. If, in terms of the present, one brings order to his family, carries out the demands of filial piety, and practices the 5 constant virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and good faith, then his associates will respect him and his name will become known throughout the country. If there is a wise ruler on the throne, he will invite such a man to become his minister or his teacher, or may even cede his position to him. Heaven, too, will come to protect and watch over such a man. Such were the so-called 5 elders who gathered about and assisted King Wen and King Wu of the Zhou dynasty, or the 28 generals of Emperor Kwangwu of the later Han, who were likened to the 28 constellations of the sky. But since such a man knows nothing about the past or future, he cannot assist his parents, his sovereign, or his teacher in making provisions for their future lives, and he is therefore guilty of failing to repay the debt he owes them. Such a person is not a true wise man or sage. Confucius declared that there were no wise men or sages in his country, but that in the land to the west there was one named Buddha, who was a sage. This indicates that non-Buddhist teaching should be regarded as a first step towards Buddhist doctrine. Confucians first taught the doctrine of propriety and music, so that when the Buddhist writings were brought to China, the concepts of the precepts, meditation, and wisdom could be more readily grasped. They taught the ideals of rulers and minister, so the distinction between superior and subordinate could be made clear. They taught the ideal of parenthood so that the importance of filial piety could be appreciated, and they explained the ideal of the teacher so that men might be taught to follow. The great teacher Miao Lo writes, "The propagation of Buddhism truly depends on this. The doctrines of propriety and music must first be set forth, after which the principles of truth can be introduced." Tian Tai states, in the Konko Myo Sutra, it is recorded that all the good teachings that exist in the world derive from this sutra. To have a profound knowledge of this world is itself Buddhism. In the Makashikan we read, I, the Buddha, have sent 3 sages to teach the people of China. In the Kuketsu, Mialo's commentary on the Makashikan, we read, the Shoujo Hogyo Sutra states that Bodhisattva Gakko appeared in the land under the name Yen Hui. Bodhisattva Kojo appeared there as Confucius, and Bodhisattva Kasho appeared as Lao Tzu. Since the sutra is speaking from the point of view of India, it refers to China as that land. Secondly, we come to the non-Buddhist teachings of India. In Brahmanism, we find the 2 deities Shiva, who has 3 eyes and 8 arms, and Vishnu. They are hailed as loving father and compassionate mother of all living beings and are also called heaven-honored and sovereign. In addition, there are 3 men, Kapila, Uluka, and Rishaba, who are known as the 3 ascetics. These ascetics lived somewhere around 800 years before the time of the Buddha. The teachings expounded by the 3 ascetics are known as the 4 Vedas and number 60,000 in works. Later, in the time of the Buddha, there were the 6 non-Buddhist teachers who studied and transmitted these various non-Buddhist scriptures and acted as tutors to the kings of the 5 regions of India. Their teachings split into 95 or 96 different lines, forming sect after sect. The banners of their pride were lifted up higher than the highest heaven, and their dogmatic rigidity was harder than metal or stone. But in their skill and depth of understanding, they surpassed anything known in Confucianism. They were able to look into the past and perceive 2, 3, or even 7 existences, a period of 80,000 eons, and they could likewise know what would happen 80,000 eons in the future. As the fundamental principle of their doctrine, some of these sects taught that causes produce effects, others taught that causes do not produce effects, while still others taught that causes both do and do not produce effects. Such were the basic doctrines of these non-Buddhist schools of thought. The devout followers of these non-Buddhist teachings observe the 5 precepts and the 10 good precepts, practice a lesser form of meditation, and, ascending through the worlds of form and formlessness, believe that they have attained nirvana when they reach the highest level of the threefold world. But although they make their way upward bit by bit like an inchworm, they fall back from the highest level and descend instead into the 3 evil paths. Not a single one succeeds in remaining on the level of heaven, though they believe that once a person has attained that level, he will never descend from it. Each approves and practices the doctrines taught by his teacher and stoutly abides by them. Thus, some of them bathe 3 times a day in the Ganges, even on cold winter days, while others pull out their hairs from their head, fling themselves against rocks, expose themselves to fire, burn their bodies, or go about stark naked. Again, there are those who believe they can gain good fortune by sacrificing many horses, or who burn grasses and trees, or make obeisance to every tree they encounter. Erroneous teachings such as these are too numerous to be counted. Their adherents pay as much respect and honor to the teachers who propound them as the various deities pay to the god Taishaku, or the court ministers pay to their ruler of the empire. But not a single person who adheres to these 95 types of higher or lower teachings ever escapes from the cycle of birth and death. Those who follow teachers of the better sort will, after 2 or 3 rebirths, fall into the lowest state of existence, while those who follow evil teachers will fall into the lowest states in their very next rebirth. And yet the final conclusion of these non-Buddhist teachings constitutes an important means of entry into Buddhism. Some of them state, 1,000 years from now the Buddha will appear in the world, while others state, 100 years from now the Buddha will appear in the world. The Nirvana Sutra remarks, all scriptures or teachings, from whatever source, are ultimately the revelations of Buddhist truth. They are not non-Buddhist teachings. And in the Lotus Sutra it is written, they, the Buddhist disciples, will display the 3 poisons and appear to cherish misleading philosophies. This is the means by which my disciples save the people. Thirdly, we come to Buddhism. One should know that the Enlightened One, the Buddha, is a great teacher for all living beings, a great eye for them, a great pillar, a great helmsman, a great field of plenty. The 4 sages and 3 ascetics of the Confucian and Brahmanical scriptures and teachings are referred to as sages, but in fact they are no more than common mortals who have not yet been able to eradicate the 3 illusions. They are referred to as wise men, but in fact they are no more than children who cannot understand the principles of cause and effect. With their teachings for a ship, could one ever cross over the great sea of birth and death? With their teachings for a bridge, could one ever escape from the maze of the 6 lower worlds of existence? But the Buddha, our great teacher, has advanced beyond even the higher states of rebirth, let alone the lower cycles of birth and death. He is able to wipe out the very root of fundamental ignorance, let alone the petty delusions that appear in the branches and leaves of thought and desire. This Buddha, from the time of his enlightenment at the age of 30 until his entry into nirvana when he was 80, expounded his sacred teachings for a period of 50 years. Each word, each phrase he spoke is the truth. Not a sentence, not a verse was uttered in error. The words of the sages and wise men preserved in the scriptures and teachings of Confucianism and Brahmanism, as we have noted, are free of error, and the words match the spirit in which they were spoken. But how much more true is this the case of the Buddha, who, from countless eons in the past, has never spoken in error? In comparison to the non-Buddhist scriptures and teachings, the doctrines that he expounded over a period of 50 years represent the great vehicle, the true words of a great man. Everything that he preached from the dawn of his enlightenment until the evening that he entered into nirvana is none other than the truth. The doctrines that the Buddha taught over a period of 50 years number 80,000. They fall into various categories such as Hinayana works and Mahayana works, provisional and true sutras, exoteric and esoteric teachings, detailed and rough discourses, truth and fallacies, correct and incorrect views. But among these, the Lotus Sutra represents the correct teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha. the true words of the Buddhas of the 10 directions in the past, present, and future. The sutras, numerous as the sands of the Ganges that the Buddha preached during the first 40 or so years of his teaching career, belong to the time when, as the Buddha said, he had not yet revealed the truth. The 8 years during which he preached the Lotus Sutra he called the time when he now must reveal the truth. Thus Tahoe Buddha came forth from the earth to testify that, quote, all you have expounded is the truth, end quote. And the Buddhas that are emanations of the original Buddha gathered together and extended their tongues up to the Brahma heaven in testimony. These words are perfectly clear, perfectly understandable, brighter than the sun on a clear day, or the full moon at midnight. Look up to them and believe them, and when you turn away, cherish them in your heart. The Lotus Sutra contains 2 important teachings. The Kusha, Jojitsu, Ritsu, Hoso, and Sanron sects have never heard even so much as the name of these teachings. The Kegon and Shingon sects, on the other hand, have surreptitiously incorporated these doctrines and made them the heart of their own teachings. The doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen is found in only one place, hidden in the depths of the Juryo chapter of the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra. The Bodhisattvas Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu were aware of it, but did not bring it forth into the light. The great teacher Tian Tai alone embraced it, and kept it ever in mind. The concept of Ichinen Sanzen begins with an understanding of the mutual possession of the 10 worlds or states of existence, but the Hoso and Sanron sects speak only of 8 worlds, and know nothing of the entirety of the 10 worlds, much less of the concept of their mutual possession. Kusha, Jojitsu, and Ritsu sects derive their teachings from the Agon Sutras. They are aware only of the 6 worlds, the 6 lower states of existence, and know nothing of the other 4 worlds that represent the higher levels of existence. They declare that in all of the 10 directions there is only one Buddha, and do not preach that there is a Buddha in any of the 10 directions. Of the principle that all sentient beings possess the Buddha nature, they of course say nothing at all. They refuse to acknowledge that even a single person possesses the Buddha nature. In spite of this, one will sometimes hear members of the Ritsu and Jojitsu sects declare that there are Buddhas in all the 10 directions, or that all beings possess the Buddha nature. This is because, at some time since the passing away of the Buddha, the men of these sects have appropriated these doctrines of Mahayana Buddhism and incorporated them into the teachings of their own sect. Similarly, in the period before the appearance of Buddhism, the proponents of Brahmanism were not so bound up in their own views. But after the appearance of the Buddha, when they had listened to and observed the Buddhist religion, they became aware of the shortcomings of their own teachings. They then conceived the clever idea of appropriating Buddhist teachings and incorporating them into the doctrines of their own sect. And, as a result, they fell into even deeper error than before. There are examples of these type of heretical teachings known as Fubukyo and Gakubupojo. The same thing occurred in the case of China. Before Buddhism was brought to China, Confucianism and Taoism were rather naive and childish affairs. But in the later Han, Buddhism was introduced to China and challenged the native doctrines. In time, as Buddhism became more popular, there were certain Buddhist monks who, because they had broken the precepts, were forced to return to secular life, or who elected to join forces with the native creeds. Through such men, Buddhist doctrines were incorporated and surreptitiously incorporated by the Confucian and Taoist sects. In Volume 5 of the Makashikan, we read, "These days there are many devilish monks who renounce their vows and return to lay life. Fearing that they will be punished for their actions, they then go over to the side of the Taoists. Hoping to gain fame and profit, they speak extravagantly of the merits of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu, usurping Buddhist concepts and reading them into the Taoist scriptures. They twist what is lofty and force it into a mean context. They destroy what is exalted and drag it down among the base, striving to put the two on an equal level." Miao Lo, in his Guketsu, comments on this passage as follows. "Though they are monks, they destroy the teachings of Buddhism. Some renounce their vows and return to lay life, as Wei Yuansung did. Then, as laymen, they work to destroy the teachings of Buddhism. Men of this kind steal and usurp the correct teachings of Buddhism and use them to supplement and bolster the heretical teachings." The passage on twisting what is lofty means that, adopting the outlook of the Taoists, they try to place Buddhism and Taoism on the same level, to make equals of truth and falsehood, though reason tells us that this could never be. Having once been followers of Buddhist teachings, they steal what is correct and use it to bolster what is erroneous. They twist the lofty doctrines of the 12 divisions and 8,000 writings of the Buddhist canon and force them into the mean context of Lao Tzu's 2 chapters and 5,000 words, using them to interpret the base and erroneous words of that text. This is what is meant by destroying what is exalted and dragging it down among the base. These comments should be carefully noted, for they explain the meaning of the foregoing description of events. The same sort of thing happened within Buddhism itself. Buddhism was introduced to China during the Yunping era, that's 58 to 75 AD, of the later Han Dynasty, and in time replaced the Confucian and Taoist teachings as the orthodox doctrine of the land. But differences of opinion developed within the Orthodox doctrine, resulting in the so-called 3 sects of the south and 7 sects of the north, which sprang up here and there like so many orchids or chrysanthemums. In the time of the Chen and Sui dynasties, however, the great teacher Tian Tai overcame these various sects and returned Buddhism once more to its primary objective of saving all living beings. Later, the Hoso and Shingon sects of Buddhism were introduced from India, and the Kegon sect also made its appearance. Among these sects, the Hoso sect set itself as the arch-rival of the Tiantai sect, because their teachings are contradictory to each other like fire and water. Later, when Tsung Sang and Zuen, the founders of the Hoso sect in China, closely examined the works of Tiantai, they came to realize that the views of their own sect were in error. Although they did not openly repudiate their own sect, it appears that in their hearts they switched their allegiance to the Tiantai teachings. From the beginning, the Kegon and Shingon sects were both provisional sects, based on provisional sutras. But Shangwu Wei and Qin Kangqi, who introduced the esoteric teachings to China, usurped the Tiantai doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen and made it the core of the teachings of their sect, adding the practice of mudras and mantras, and convincing themselves that their teachings surpassed Tiantai's. As a result, students of Buddhism, unaware of the real facts, came to believe that the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen was to be found in the Dainichi Sutra, which had been brought from India. Similarly, in the time of the Kegon patriarch Chen Quan, the Tiantai doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen was surreptitiously incorporated and used to interpret the passage in the Kegon Sutra that reads, quote, "The mind is like a skilled painter," end quote. People are unaware that this is what happened. In the case of our own country of Japan, Kegon and the other sects that comprise the 6 Nara sects were introduced to Japan before the Tendai and Shingon sects. The Kegon, Sanran, Hoso, and other Nara sects argued and contended, as inimical to one another as water and fire. When the great teacher Dengyo appeared in Japan, he not only exposed the errors of the 6 Nara sects, but also made it clear that the Shingon sect had stolen the principles of the Lotus Sutra as expounded by Tiantai and made them the heart of the teachings of its own sect. The great teacher Dengyo called upon the leaders of the other sects to set aside their arbitrary views and interpretations and to examine matters solely in light of the scriptures themselves. As a result, in debate, he was able to defeat 8 eminent monks of the 6 Nara sects, then 12 monks, then 14, then over 300, including Kobodaishi. Soon there was not a single person in all Japan who did not acknowledge allegiance to the Tendai sect, and the great temples of Nara, the Shingon temple of Toji in Kyoto, and other temples throughout all the provinces became subordinate to the head temple of the Tendai sect at Mount Hiei. The great teacher Dengyo also made it clear that the founders of the various other sects of Buddhism in China, by acknowledging allegiance to the doctrines of the great teacher Tiantai, had escaped committing the error of slandering the true teaching of Buddhism. However, later, conditions in the world declined, and men became increasingly shallow in wisdom. They no longer studied or understood the profound doctrines of the Tendai sect, and the other sects became more and more firmly attached to their prejudiced views. Eventually, the 6 Nara sects and the Shingon sect turned upon and attacked the Tendai sect. The latter, growing ever weaker in the end, found that it was no match for the other sects. To aggravate the situation, absurd new sects such as Zen and Jodo appeared, and began attacking the Tendai sect as well, and more of its lay believers transferred their allegiance to these unorthodox teachings. In the end, even the monks who were looked upon to as the most eminent leaders of the Tendai sect all admitted defeat and lent their support to the heretical sects. Not only Tendai, but Shingon and the 6 Nara sects as well were forced to yield their lands and estates to the new heretical sects, and the true teachings ceased to be propagated. As a result, the sun goddess, the god Hachiman, the mountain king of Mount Hiei, and the other benevolent deities who guard the nation, no longer able to taste the flavor of the true teachings, departed from the land. Demons came forward to take their place, and it became apparent that the nation was doomed. Here, I would like to state my humble opinion that the teachings expounded by the Buddha Shakyamuni during the first 40 or so years of his teaching differ markedly from those expounded in the Lotus Sutra during the last 8 years of his life. Contemporary scholars have already expressed the opinion, and it is my conviction as well, that the chief difference lies in the fact that the Lotus Sutra teaches that persons in the 2 realms of Shomon, or learning, and Engaku, or realization, can attain Buddhahood, and that the Buddha Shakyamuni in reality attained enlightenment at an inconceivably distant time in the past. When we examine the Lotus Sutra, we see that it predicts that Shariputra would become the flower-light Tathagata, and that Mahakasyapa would become the light-bright Tathagata. Subhuti would become the wonderful form Tathagata. Katyayana would become the Jabunnada, golden light Tathagata. Maudgalyayana would become the Tamalapatra, sandalwood fragrance Buddha. Purna will become the law-bright Tathagata. Ananda will become the mountain sea wisdom unrestricted power king Buddha. Rahula will become the stepping on 7 treasures flowers Tathagata. The 500 and 700 Shoman and Engaku disciples will become the universal brightness Tathagatas. The 2,000 Shoman who have more to learn or do not have more to learn will become the treasure form Tathagatas, The nuns Mahaprajapati and Yasodhara would become the Tathagata as gladly seen by all sentient beings and form resplendent with 10 million lights, respectively. Thus, if we examine the Lotus Sutra, we will realize that these persons are worthy of great honor. But when we search through the scriptures containing the teachings expounded in the periods previous to the Lotus Sutra, we find to our regret that the situation is far different. The Buddha Shakyamuni, the world-honored one, is a man of truthful words. Therefore, he is designated the sage and the great man. In the non-Buddhist scriptures of India and China, there are also persons called worthy men, sages, or heavenly ascetics, because they speak words of truth. But because the Buddha surpasses all these, he is known as the great man. When he expounded the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha said that the Buddhas appear in this world for one great reason. He also said, "In these more than 40 years, I have not yet revealed the truth." That the world-honored one has long expounded his doctrines and must now reveal the truth. And that, honestly, discarding the provisional teachings, I will expound the supreme law. Taho Buddha added his testimony to the words of the Buddha, and the emanations of the Buddha put forth their tongues as a token of assent. Who, then, could possibly doubt that Shariputra will in the future become the flower-light Tathagata, that Mahakasyapa will become the light-bright Tathagata, and that the other predictions made by the Buddha will come true? Nevertheless, all the sutras preceding the Lotus Sutra also represent the true words of the Buddha. The Kegon Sutra states, "The great medicine king tree, which is the wisdom of the Buddha, has only two places where it will not grow and bring benefit to the world. It will not grow if it falls into the vast void, which is the deep pit of the Shomon and the Engaku, or if it is drowned in the profoundly heretical and passion-bound waters of those unworthy beings who destroy the roots of goodness within themselves." This passage may be explained as follows. In the Snow Mountains, there is a huge tree that has numberless roots. It is called the Great Medicine King Tree, and is the monarch of all the trees that grow in the continent of Jambudvipa. It measures 168,000 yojana in height. All the other trees and plants in Jambudvipa depend upon the roots, branches, flowers, and fruit of this tree to attain their own flowering and fruition. Therefore, this tree is employed as a metaphor for the Buddha nature, and the various other trees and plants stand for all the sentient beings of the world. But this great tree will not grow in a fiery pit or in the watery circle. The fiery pit is used as a metaphor for the state of mind of the Shomon and the Engaku, and the watery circle is used as a metaphor for the life conditions of men of incorrigible disbelief. The scripture is saying that these two categories of beings will never attain Buddhahood. The Daijuku Sutra states, "There are two types of persons who are destined to die and not to be reborn, and who in the end will never be able to understand or repay their obligation. One is the Shomon, and the other is the Engaku. Suppose that a person falls into a deep pit. That one person will be unable to benefit himself or to benefit others. The Shomon and the Engaku are like this. They fall into the pit of nirvana and can benefit neither themselves nor others." The more than 3,000 volumes of the non-Buddhist writings of China on the whole stress two principles, namely filial piety and loyalty to the sovereign. But loyalty is nothing more than filial piety extended to persons outside the family. Filial piety may be described as lofty. Though heaven is lofty, it is no loftier than the ideal of filial piety. Filial piety may be called deep. Though earth is deep, it is no deeper than filial piety. Sages and worthy men are the product of families where filial piety is taught. It goes without saying, therefore, that persons who study the teachings of Buddhism must also observe the ideal of filial piety and understand and repay their obligations. The disciples of the Buddha must without fail understand the four types of obligation and know how to repay them. In addition, Shariputra, Mahakasyapa, and the other disciples who belonged to the two realms of Shomon and Engaku carefully observed the 250 precepts and the 3,000 rules of conduct, practiced the three types of meditation, carried out the teachings of the Agon Sutras, and freed themselves from the illusions of thought and desire in the threefold world. They should, therefore, have been models in the understanding and repaying of obligations. And yet the Buddha declared that they were men who did not understand obligation. He said this because when a man leaves his parents and home to become a monk, he should always have as his goal the salvation of his father and mother. But these men belonged to the two realms of Shomon and Engaku, and although they thought they had attained nirvana for themselves, they did nothing to benefit others. And even if they had done a certain amount of benefit to others, they themselves were bound to a path whereby they could never attain Buddhahood, and could therefore never bring salvation to their parents. Thus, contrary to what one might expect, they became known as men who did not understand their obligations. In the Vimalakirti Sutra, we read, quote, "Vimalakirti once more questioned Monju, saying, 'What are the seeds of Buddhahood?' Monju replied, 'All the delusions and defilements are the seeds of Buddhahood.' Even though a person commits the 5 cardinal sins and is condemned to the hell of incessant suffering, he is capable of aspiring to the lofty status of Buddhahood." End quote. The same sutra also says, quote, "Good listeners, let me give you a metaphor. The plains and highlands will never bring forth the stems and blossoms of the lotus or the water lily, but the muddy fields that are low-lying and damp, that is where you will find these flowers growing." End quote. It also says, quote, one who has already become an arhat and achieved the level of truth that goes with arhatship can never conceive the desire to attain Buddhahood or to realize the Buddha nature in himself. He is like a man who has destroyed the 5 sensory organs and therefore can never again enjoy the 5 delights that go with them. End quote. The point of this sutra is that the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and stupidity are the seeds of Buddhahood, and the 5 cardinal sins of killing one's father, etc., are likewise the seeds of Buddhahood. Even if the high plane should bring forth lotus flowers, the 2 states of Shoman and Engaku would never lead to Buddhahood. The text is saying that when the goodness of these 2 states is compared with the evils of the state of common delusion, it will be found that, though the evils of common delusion can lead to Buddhahood, the virtue of the Shoman and Engaku never can. The various Hinayana sutras censor evil and praise virtue, but this sutra, the Vimalakirti, condemns the virtues of the Shoman and Engaku and praises the evils of the common mortal. It would almost appear that it is not a Buddhist scripture at all, but rather the teachings of some heretical school. But the point is that it wants to make absolutely clear that the Shoman and the Engaku can never become Buddhas. The Hodo Dharani Sutra states, quote, Manju said to Shariputra, can a withered tree put forth new blossoms? Can a mountain stream turn and flow back to its source? Can a shattered rock join itself together again? Can a scorched seed send out sprouts? Shariputra replied, no. Manju said, if these things are impossible, then why do you come with joy in your heart and ask me if Buddhahood has been predicted for you in the future? End quote. The passage means that just as a withered tree puts forth no blossoms, a mountain stream never flows backwards, a shattered rock can never be joined, and a scorched seed can never sprout, so those in the 2 states of Shoman and Engaku can never attain Buddhahood. In their case, the seeds of Buddhahood have been scorched. In the Daibon Hanya Sutra we read, quote, all you heavenly beings, if you have not yet conceived a desire for Buddhahood, now is the time to do so. If you should once enter the realm of Shoman, you would no longer be capable of conceiving such a desire for Buddhahood. Why is this? Because you would be outside the world of birth and death. End quote. This passage indicates that the Buddha is not pleased with the persons in the 2 realms of Shoman and Engaku because they do not conceive the desire for Buddhahood, but he is pleased with the heavenly beings because they do conceive such a desire. The Shuryogon Sutra states, if a person who has committed the 5 cardinal sins should hear of this powerful meditation and should conceive the desire for the highest enlightenment, then, contrary to what you might believe, he would be capable of attaining Buddhahood. But, World-Honored One, an arhat who has cut off all desires is like a broken vessel. He will never be worthy or capable of receiving this meditation. End quote. The Vimalakirti Sutra says, quote, those who give alms to you are cultivating for themselves no field of fortune. Those who give support to you will instead fall into the 3 evil paths. End quote. This passage means that the human and heavenly beings who give support to the sage monks such as Mahakasyapa and Shariputra will inevitably fall into the 3 evil paths. Sage monks such as these, one would suppose, must be the eyes of the human and heavenly worlds and the teachers of all beings, second only to the Buddha himself. It must have been very much against common expectation that the Buddha spoke out time and time again against such men before the great assemblies of human and heavenly beings, as we have seen him do. Was he really trying to scold his own disciples to death? In addition, he employed countless different metaphors in expressing his condemnation of the Shoman and Engaku, calling them donkey milk as compared to cow's milk of the Bodhisattva, clay vessels as compared to the vessels of gold, or the glimmer of a firefly as compared to the light of the sun. He did not speak of this in 1 word or 2, in 1 day or 2, in 1 month or 2, in 1 year or 2, or in 1 sutra or 2, but over a period of more than 40 years, in countless sutras, addressing himself to great assemblies of countless persons, condemning the Shoman and the Engaku without a single extenuating word. Thus everyone learned that his condemnation was true. Heavens learned it, and earth learned it. Not merely 1 or 2 persons, but 1 billion learned and heard of it, as did all the humans and heavenly beings, the Shoman and the Engaku, and the great Bodhisattvas gathered in assembly from the worlds of the 10 directions, the worlds of form and formlessness, the 6 heavens of the world of desire, the 4 continents, and the 5 regions of India, and the heavenly beings of the threefold world, the dragon kings and the asuras. Then each of these beings returned to his own land, explaining the teachings of the Buddha of the present world one by one to the inhabitants of his respective land, so that there was not a single being in the countless worlds of the 10 directions who did not understand that Mahakasyapa, Shariputra, and those like them would never attain Buddhahood, and that it was wrong to give them alms in support. In the Lotus Sutra preached during the last 8 years of his life, however, the Buddha suddenly refuted his earlier position and instead taught that persons in the 2 stages of Shoman and Engaku can in fact attain Buddhahood. Could the human and heavenly beings gathered in the great assembly to listen to him be expected to believe this? Would they not rather reject it and, in addition, begin to entertain doubts about all the sutras preached in the earlier periods? They would wonder if all the teachings put forward in the entire 50 years of the Buddha's preaching were not, in fact, empty and erroneous doctrines. To be sure, there is a passage in the Muryogi Sutra that says, "In these more than 40 years I have not yet revealed the truth." Nevertheless, one might wonder if the devil had not taken on the Buddha's form and preached this sutra of the last 8 years, the Lotus Sutra. In the sutra, however, the Buddha describes quite specifically how his disciples in the Shomon and Engaku realms will attain Buddhahood, and reveals the time and the lands in which they will appear, the names they will bear, and the disciples they will teach. Thus it becomes apparent that there is a contradiction in the words of the Buddha. This is what people mean when they say that his own sayings are at variance with themselves. This is why the Brahmanists laugh at the Buddha and call him the great prevaricator. But just as the human and heavenly beings in the Great Assembly were feeling downcast in the face of this contradiction, Tahoe Buddha, who dwells in the world of treasure purity in the east, appeared in a treasure tower decorated with 7 kinds of treasures, and measuring 500 yojanas high and 250 yojanas wide. The human and heavenly beings in the Great Assembly accused the Buddha of contradicting his own words, and although the Buddha answered in one way or another, he was in considerable embarrassment, being unable to dispel their doubts, when the treasure tower emerged out of the ground before him and ascended into the sky. It came forth like the full moon rising behind the eastern mountains in the dark of night. The treasure tower ascended into the sky, clinging neither to the earth nor to the roof of the heavens, but hanging in mid-air, and from within the treasure tower a pure, resounding voice issued, speaking words of testimony. As the Lotus Sutra describes it, quote, "At that time a loud voice issued from the treasure tower, speaking in praise. Excellent, excellent, Shakyamuni, world-honored one. For the sake of the multitude, you skillfully preach the Lotus Sutra, the great wisdom to save all beings equally, which is the law taught to the Bodhisattvas and the doctrine cherished and guarded by the Buddhas. It is as you say, Shakyamuni, world-honored one. All you have expounded is the truth." End quote. Elsewhere in the Lotus Sutra, it says, quote, "At that time, the world-honored one manifested his great spiritual powers in the presence of Monju and the other hundreds of thousands of billions of bodhisattvas who had from the past times lived in the Saha world, as well as the human beings and non-human beings. He extended his long, broad tongue till it reached upward to the Brahma heaven. Then he emitted light from all his pores until it reached the worlds of the 10 directions, and all the other Buddhas seated on Lion King thrones under the jewel trees throughout the universe did the same, extending their long, broad tongues and emitting innumerable rays of light." End quote. In another chapter it says, quote, "All the Buddhas who had gathered from the 10 directions of the universe returned to their respective lands, and the Buddha ordered that the treasure tower of Tahoe Buddha return to its original place." End quote. In the past, when the Buddha preached for the first time after attaining enlightenment, the Buddhas of the 10 directions appeared to counsel and encourage him, and various great bodhisattvas were dispatched to him. When he preached the Hanya Sutra, he covered the major world system with his long tongue, and 1,000 Buddhas appeared in the 10 directions. When he preached the Konko-myo Sutra, the 4 Buddhas appeared in the 4 directions, and when he preached the Amida Sutra, the Buddhas of the 6 directions covered the major world system with their tongues. And when he preached the Daijoku Sutra, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions gathered in the great treasure chamber that stands on the border between the worlds of form and desire. But when we compare the auspicious signs that accompany those sutras with those accompanying the Lotus Sutra, we find that they are like a yellow stone compared to gold, a white cloud to a white mountain, ice to a silver mirror, or the color black to the color blue. A person with clear vision can distinguish one from the other, but the bleary-eyed, the squint-eyed, the one-eyed, and the wrong-viewed will be likely to confuse them. Since the Kegon Sutra was the first sutra to be preached, there were no previous words of the Buddha for it to contradict, and so it naturally raised no doubts. In the case of the Daijoku Sutra, Hanya Sutra, Konkomyo Sutra, and Amida Sutra, the Buddha, in order to censure the Hinayana ideal of the Shomon and Engaku realms, described the Pure Lands of the 10 directions and thereby inspired bodhisattvas and common mortals to aspire to attain them. Thus he caused the Shomon and Engaku to abandon the ideal of Hinayana. Again, because there are certain differences between the Hinayana Sutras and the Mahayana Sutras mentioned above, we find that in some cases Buddhas appeared in the 10 directions, and others great bodhisattvas were dispatched from the 10 directions, or it was made clear that the particular sutra was expounded in the worlds of the 10 directions, or that various Buddhas came from the 10 directions to meet in assembly. In some cases, it was said that Shakyamuni Buddha covered the major world system with his tongue, while in others it was the various Buddhas who put forth their tongues. All of these statements are intended to combat the views expounded in the Hinayana Sutras, that in the worlds of the 10 directions there is only one Buddha. But in the case of the Lotus Sutra, it differs so greatly from the previous Mahayana Sutras that Shariputra and the other Shomon disciples, the great bodhisattvas, and the various humans and heavenly beings, when they heard the Buddha preach it, were led to think, Is this not the devil who has taken on the Buddha's form? And yet those bleary-eyed men of the Kegon, Hoso, Sanran, Shingon, and Nembutsu sects all seem to think that their own particular sutras are exactly the same as the Lotus Sutra. This is what I call wretched perception indeed. While the Buddha was still in the world, there were undoubtedly those who set aside the sutras he had taught during the first 40 or more years of his career and embraced the Lotus Sutra. But after he passed away, it must have been difficult to find persons who would open and read this sutra and accept its teachings. To begin with, the sutras preached earlier run to countless words, while the Lotus Sutra is limited in length. The earlier sutras are numerous, but the Lotus Sutra is no more than a single work. The earlier sutras were preached over a period of many years, but the Lotus Sutra was preached in a mere 8 years. Moreover, the Buddha, as we have seen, has been called the Great Liar, and therefore one can hardly be expected to believe his words. If one makes a great effort to believe the unbelievable, he can perhaps bring himself to believe in the earlier sutras, but not in the Lotus Sutra. Nowadays, there are many persons who appear to believe in the Lotus Sutra, but in fact, they do not really believe in it. It is only when someone assures them that the Lotus Sutra is the same as the Dainichi Sutra, or that's the same as the Kegon Sutra or the Amida Sutra, that they are pleased and become converts to the faith. If someone tells them that the Lotus Sutra is completely different from all the other sutras, they will not listen to him. Or even if they should listen, they would not think that the person was really speaking the truth. Nichiren has this to say. It is now over 700 years since Buddhism was introduced to Japan. During that time, only the great teacher Denyo truly understood the Lotus Sutra, but no one is willing to heed this fact which Nichiren has been teaching. It is just as the Lotus Sutra says, quote, to seize Mount Sumeru and fling it far off to the measureless Buddha lands, that is not difficult. But in the evil times after the Buddha's passing to be able to preach this sutra, that is difficult indeed. End quote. The teachings I am expounding are in complete accord with the sutra itself, but the Nirvana Sutra, which was designed to propagate the Lotus Sutra, says, quote, in the troubled times of the later day of the law, those who slander the true law will occupy all the land in the 10 directions, while the supporters of the true law will possess no more land than can be placed on the top of a fingernail. End quote. What do you think of that? Would you say that the people of Japan who oppose me can be squeezed into the space of a fingernail? Would you say that I, Nichiren, occupy the 10 directions? Consider the matter carefully. In the reign of a wise king, justice will prevail, but when a foolish king reigns, then injustice will have supremacy. One should understand that, in similar fashion, when a sage is in the world, then the true significance of the Lotus Sutra will become apparent. In my remarks here, I've been contrasting the early sutras with the theoretical teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and it would appear as though the early sutras are in a position to prevail. But if they really win out over the theoretical teachings of the Lotus Sutra, then it means that Shariputra and the others, who are in the 2 realms of Shoman and Engaku, will never be able to attain Buddhahood. That would surely be lamentable. I turn now to the second important teaching of the Lotus Sutra. Shakyamuni Buddha was born in the Kalpa of Continuance, in the 9th small Kalpa, when the span of human life was diminishing and measured 100 years. He was the grandson of King Simhahanu and the son and heir of King Suddhodana. As a boy, he was known as the Crown Prince Siddhartha, or the Bodhisattva all goals completed. At the age of 19, he became a monk, and at 30, he achieved Buddhahood. At Buddha Gaya, his place of enlightenment, he first revealed the ceremony of Vairochana Buddha of the Lotus Treasury World and expounded the 10 mysteries, the 6 forms, and the supreme mystic law of the perfect harmony of the phenomenal world. At that time, the Buddhas of the 10 directions appeared before him, and all the Bodhisattvas gathered about like clouds. In view of the place where Shakyamuni preached, the capacity of the listeners, the presence of the Buddha, and the fact that it was the first sermon, is there any reason the Buddha could have concealed or held back the supreme law? Therefore, the Kegon Sutra says, quote, he displayed his power at will and expounded a sutra of true perfection, end quote. The work, which consists of 60 volumes, is indeed a sutra of true perfection in its every word and phrase. It may be compared to the wish-granting gem, which, though it is a single gem, is the equal of a countless number of gems. For the single gem can rain down 10,000 treasures, which are equal to the treasures brought forth by 10,000 gems. In the same way, one word of the Kegon Sutra contains all the meaning encompassed in 10,000 words. The passage that expounds the identity of mind, Buddha, and all living things represents not only the core of Kegon teachings, but of the teachings of the Hoso, Sanran, Shingon, and Tendai sects as well. In such a superb sutra, how could there be any truths that are hidden from the hearer? And yet we find the sutra declaring that persons of the 2 realms of Shoman and Engaku and those who belong to the category of incorrigible disbelief can never attain Buddhahood. Here is the flaw in the gem. Moreover, in 3 places the sutra speaks of Shakyamuni Buddha as attaining enlightenment for the first time in India. It thus hides the fact that, as revealed in the Juryo chapter of the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni Buddha actually attained enlightenment in the remote past. Thus, the Kegon Sutra is in fact a chipped gem, a moon veiled in the clouds, a sun in eclipse. How incomprehensible. The Agon, Hodo, Hanya, and Dainichi Sutras, since they were expounded by the Buddha, are splendid works, and yet they cannot begin to compare with the Kegon Sutra. Therefore, one could hardly expect that doctrines concealed even in the Kegon Sutra would be revealed in these sutras. Thus, we find that the Zo-Agon Sutra speaks of Shakyamuni Buddha as having attained enlightenment for the first time in India. The Daijuku Sutra says, quote, "It is 16 years since the Buddha first attained enlightenment," end quote. And the Vimalakirti states, quote, "For the first time the Buddha sat beneath the tree and through his might conquered the devil," end quote. Likewise, the Dainichi Sutra describes the Buddha's enlightenment as having taken place, quote, "some years ago when I sat in the place of meditation," end quote. And the Nino Hanya Sutra refers to it as an event of, quote, 29 years ago, end quote. It is hardly surprising that these sutras should speak in this fashion, but there is something that is an astonishment to both the ear and the eye. This is the fact that the Muryogi Sutra also speaks in the same way. In the Muryogi Sutra, the Buddha denies the Kegon Sutra concept of the phenomenal world as created by the mind alone, the Daijuku Sutra concept of the ocean imprint meditation, and the Hanya Sutra concept of the identity and non-duality of all beings when he declares, quote, "I have not yet revealed the truth," end quote. The Muryoga Sutra regards the practices taught in the previous sutras as the kalpa after kalpa of training that the bodhisattva must undergo in order to attain Buddhahood. However, the same sutra says, "Previously, I went to the place of meditation and sat upright beneath the Bodhi tree, and after 6 years I was able to attain the supreme enlightenment," using the same type of language as the Kegon Sutra when it talks about Shakyamuni Buddha having attained enlightenment for the first time in India. Strange as this may seem, we may suppose that since the Muryogi Sutra is intended to serve as an introduction to the Lotus Sutra, it deliberately refrains from speaking about doctrines to be revealed in the Lotus Sutra itself. But when we turn to the Lotus Sutra itself, we find that in the sections where the Buddha discusses the 3 realms of Shoman, Engaku, and the Bodhisattva as provisional goals, he says, quote, "The true entity of all phenomena can only be understood and shared between Buddhas," end quote. Quote, "The world-honored one has long expounded his doctrine and now must reveal the truth," end quote. He says elsewhere, and, quote, "Honestly discarding the provisional teachings, I will expound the supreme law," end quote. Moreover, Taho Buddha testifies to the verity of the 8 chapters, and the theoretical teaching in which these passages occur, declaring that these are all true. We should suppose, therefore, that in them there would be nothing held back or concealed. Nevertheless, the Buddha hides the fact that he attained enlightenment countless eons ago, for he says, quote, "When I sat in the place of meditation and gazed at the tree and walked around it," end quote. This is surely the most astounding fact of all. In the Yujutsu chapter, a multitude of bodhisattvas who had not been seen previously in the more than 40 years of the Buddha's preaching career suddenly appear, and the Buddha says, quote, "I taught them and caused them for the first time to aspire to enlightenment," end quote. Bodhisattva Miroku, puzzled by this announcement, says, "World-honored one, when you were crowned prince, you left the palace of the Shakyas and sat in the place of meditation not far from the city of Gaya, where you attained the supreme enlightenment. A mere 40 years or so have passed since then. In that short period of time, how could you have accomplished so much great work as a Buddha?" In order to dispel this doubt and puzzlement, the Buddha then preached the Juryo chapter, referring first to the version of the events presented in the earlier sutras and the theoretical teachings of the Lotus Sutra. He says, quote, "All the human and heavenly beings and the Ashuras at present believe that Shakyamuni Buddha, after leaving the palace of the Shakyas, sat in the place of meditation not far from the city of Gaya and there attained the supreme enlightenment," end quote. But then, in order to dispel their doubts, he says, quote, "However, men of devout faith, the time is limitless and boundless. 100,000, 10,000, 100,000 Nayuta eons since I, in fact, attained Buddhahood," end quote. All of the provisional sutras, such as the Kegon, Hanya, and Dainichi, not only conceal the fact that people in the 2 realms of Shoman and Engaku can attain Buddhahood, but they also fail to make clear that the Buddha attained enlightenment countless eons in the past. These sutras are guilty of 2 errors. First, because they teach that the 10 worlds of existence are separate from one another, they fail to move beyond the provisional doctrines and to reveal the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen, as it is expounded in the theoretical chapters of the Lotus Sutra. Second, because they teach that Shakyamuni Buddha attained enlightenment for the first time in India and do not explain his true identity, they fail to reveal the fact stressed in the essential teaching that the Buddha attained enlightenment countless eons ago. These 2 great doctrines are the core of the Buddha's lifetime teaching, and the very heart and marrow of all the sutras. The Hoben chapter, which belongs to the theoretical teaching, expounds the doctrine of Nichiren Sanzen, making clear that persons in the 2 realms of Shoman and Engaku can achieve Buddhahood. It thus avoids committing one of the 2 errors perpetrated in the earlier sutras, but it nevertheless fails to reveal that the Buddha attained enlightenment countless eons ago. Thus, the true doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen remains unclear, and the attainment of Buddhahood by persons in the two realms is not properly affirmed. Such teachings are like the moon seen in the water, or rootless plants that drift on the waves. When we come to the chapters of the Lotus Sutra that put forth the essential teaching, then the belief that Shakyamuni obtained Buddhahood for the first time in India is demolished, and the effects of the four teachings are likewise demolished. When the effects of the four teachings are demolished, the causes are likewise demolished. Thus, the cause and effect of the 10 worlds of existence, as expounded in the earlier sutras and the theoretical teachings of the Lotus Sutra, are wiped out, and the cause and effect of the 10 worlds and the essential teaching are revealed. This is the doctrine of original cause and original effect. It reveals that the 9 other worlds are all present in the beginningless Buddhahood, and that the Buddhahood is inherent in the beginningless 9 other worlds. This is the true mutual possession of the 10 worlds, the true 100 worlds and 1,000 factors, the true Ichinen Sanzen. When we consider the matter in this light, we can see that the Vairocana Buddha described in the Kegon Sutra, the Shakyamuni described in the Agon Sutras, and the Provisional Buddhas described in the Hodo and Hanya Sutras, such as the Konkomyo, Amida, and Dainichi Sutras, are no more than the reflections of the Buddha of the Juryo chapter, like reflections of the moon that float on the surfaces of various large and small bodies of water. The scholars of the various sects of Buddhism, confused by the doctrines of their own sect and unaware of the teachings of the Juryo chapter of the Lotus Sutra, mistake the reflection in the water for the actual moon, some of them entering the water and trying to grasp it in their hands, others to snare it with a rope. As Tian Tai says, they know nothing of the moon in the sky, but gaze only at the moon in the pond. Nichiren has this to remark. Though the Lotus Sutra teaches that persons in the two realms of Shomon and Engaku can attain Buddhahood, this view tends to be overshadowed by the opposite view propounded in the sutras that precede the Lotus Sutra. How much more so is this the case with the doctrine that the Buddha attained enlightenment countless eons ago? For, in this case, it is not the Lotus Sutra as a whole that stands in contradiction to the earlier sutras, but the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra that stands in contradiction both to the earlier sutras and to the chapters of the Lotus Sutra that deal with the theoretical teaching. Moreover, of the chapters of the Lotus Sutra that deal with the essential teaching, all of them with the exception of the Yujutsu and Juryo chapters take the view that Shakyamuni Buddha attained enlightenment for the first time in India. The 40 volumes of the Nirvana Sutra, preached by the Buddha on his deathbed in the grove of Sao trees, as well as the other Mahayana sutras except the Lotus Sutra, have not one single word to say about the fact that the Buddha attained enlightenment countless ages ago. They speak of the Hoshin, or Dharma body, of the Buddha as being without beginning and without end, but they do not reveal that the other two bodies, the Hoshin, or wisdom body, and the Ojin, or manifested body, are the same in nature as the Dharma body. How then can we expect men to cast aside the vast body of writings represented by the earlier Mahayana sutras, the Nirvana Sutra, and the majority of the chapters in the Lotus Sutra that deal with the theoretical and essential teachings, and put all their faith simply in the two chapters, Yujutsu and Juryo? If we examine the origin of the sect called Hoso, we find that 900 years after Shakyamuni passed away, in India there was a great teacher of doctrine called Asanga. At night he entered the halls of Tushita, where he came before Bodhisattva Miroku, and received instruction in the teaching propounded by the Buddha during his lifetime. In the daytime he worked to propagate the Hoso doctrines in the state of Ayodhya. Among his disciples were various great teachers of doctrine, such as his younger brother Vasubandhu, Dharmapala, Nanda, and Shilabhadra. The great ruler, King Shiladitya, converted to his teachings, and in time the people of all the 5 regions of India abandoned their arrogance and declared themselves followers of his faith. The Chinese monk Xuanzang journeyed to India, spending 17 years visiting 130 or more states in India. He rejected all the other teachings of Buddhism and brought back the doctrines of the Hoso sect to China and presented them to the wise sovereign, Emperor Taizong of the Tang. Xuanzang numbered among his disciples such men as Shenfang, Jiashang, Puquang, and Kueqi. He preached his teachings in the great temple in the capital city of Chang'an, called Zhuenzhou, and spread them through more than 360 districts of China. In the reign of Emperor Kotoku, the 37th sovereign of Japan, the monks Doji and Dosho went to China and studied these doctrines, and on their return preached them at Yamashina Temple. In this way, the Hoso sect became the leading sect of Buddhism throughout all 3 lands of India, China, and Japan. According to this sect, in all the teachings of the Buddha, from the Kegon Sutra, the earliest of the sutras, to the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras that were preached last, it is laid down that those who do not possess the innate nature to become Buddhas, and those predestined for the realms of Shomon and Engaku, can never become Buddhas. The Buddha, they say, never contradicts himself, Therefore, if he has once declared that these persons will never be able to attain Buddhahood, then, even though the sun and moon may fall to the earth, and the great earth itself may turn upside down, that declaration can never be altered. In the earlier sutras, those who do not possess the innate nature to become Buddhas, or those predestined for the realms of Shomon and Engaku, were said to be incapable of attaining Buddhahood. Therefore, even in the Lotus or Nirvana Sutra, it never said that they can't in fact do so. Close your eyes and consider the matter, the members of the Hosso sect would say. If it had, in fact, been plainly stated in the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras that those who do not possess the innate nature to become Buddhas, or those predestined for the two realms can actually attain Buddhahood, then why would not the great teachers of doctrines such as Asanga and Vasubandhu, or eminent monks such as Zhuangzang and Zuen, have taken notice of this fact? Why did they not mention it in their own writings? Why did they not accept the belief and transmit it to later ages? Why did not Asanga question Bodhisattva Miroku about it? People like you, Nichiren, claim that you are basing your assertions on the text of the Lotus Sutra, but in fact you are simply accepting the biased views of men like Tiantai, Miao-Lo, and Dengyo, and interpreting the text of the sutra in the light of their teachings. Therefore, you claim that the Lotus Sutra is as different from the earlier sutras as fire from water. Again, there are the Kegon and Shingon sects, which are incomparably higher in level than the Hosso and Sanron sects. They claim that the doctrines that persons in the realms of Shomon and Engaku may attain Buddhahood, and that the Buddha achieved enlightenment countless eons ago, are to be found not only in the Lotus Sutra, but in the Kegon and Dainichi Sutras as well. According to these sects, the Kegon Patriarch Tushun, Qiyen, Fatang, and Chen Quan, and the Shingon masters Shanwu Wei, Qin Kangqi, and Pu Kung were far more eminent than Tiantai or Dengyo. Moreover, they claim that Shanwu Wei's teachings descend in an unbroken line from the Buddha Mahavajrayana. How could men like this, who are manifestations of the Buddha, possibly be mistaken, they ask. They point to the passage in the Kegon Sutra that reads, quote, "Some people perceive that an inestimable number of eons have passed since the Buddha Shakyamuni attained enlightenment," end quote. Or the passage in the Dainichi Sutra that says, quote, "I am the source and beginning of all things," end quote. Why, they ask, would anyone claim that it is the Juryo chapter of the Lotus alone that expounds the doctrine that the Buddha attained enlightenment long ago? Persons who do so are like frogs at the bottom of a well who have never seen the great sea, or ignorant hillfolk who know nothing of the capital. Quote, "You people look only at the Juryo chapter and know nothing of the Kegon, Dainichi, and the other sutras. Do you believe that in India and China and Sila and Pakche, people believe, as they do in Japan, that these two doctrines are limited to the Lotus Sutra alone?" End quote. As we have seen, the Lotus Sutra, which was preached over a period of 8 years, is quite different from the earlier sutras preached over a period of some 40 years. If one had to choose between the two, one ought by right to choose the Lotus Sutra. And yet the earlier sutras in many ways appear to be superior. While the Buddha was still alive, there would have been good reason for choosing the Lotus Sutra. But in the ages since his passing, the teachers and scholars have in most cases shown a preference for the earlier sutras. This has made it extremely difficult to believe in the Lotus Sutra. In addition, the former and the middle days of the law are coming to an end. Sages and worthy men grow fewer and fewer, and deluded persons constantly increase in number. People are prone to make mistakes even in shallow worldly affairs, so how much more likely are they to be mistaken about the profound Buddhist teachings that lead to enlightenment? Vatsiputriya and the ascetic Vaipulya were keen and perceptive, but they still confused the Hinayana and Mahayana sutras. Muku and Mato were very clever by nature, but they could not distinguish properly between the provisional teaching and the true teaching. These men lived during the 1,000-year period known as the former day of the law, not far removed in time from the Buddha himself, and in the same country of India, and yet they fell into error, as we have seen. How much more likely, therefore, that the people in China and Japan should do so, since these countries are far removed from India and speak different languages from it. As many centuries have passed since the Buddha's death, men have grown increasingly dull by nature. Their lifespan diminishes steadily, and the poisons of greed, anger, and stupidity continue to multiply. The Buddhist scriptures are all misunderstood. Who these days has the wisdom to interpret them correctly? Therefore the Buddha predicted in the Nirvana Sutra, quote, "In the latter day of the law, those who abide by the true teachings will occupy no more land than can be placed on top of a fingernail, while those who slander the true teachings will occupy all the lands in the 10 directions." End quote. In the Honmet Tsujin Sutra, we find this passage, quote, "Those who slander the true teachings will be as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, and those who abide by the true teachings will be no more than 1 or 2 pebbles." End quote. Though 500 or 1,000 years go by, it will be difficult to find even a single person who believes in the true teachings. Those who fall into the evil states of existence because of ordinary crimes will be as insignificant in number as the space of a fingernail. but those who do so because of violations of the Buddhist teachings will occupy all the lands in the 10 directions. More monks than laymen, and more nuns than lay women, will fall into the evil states of existence. Here, Nichiren would like to make a statement. Already over 200 years have passed since the world entered the latter day of the law. I was born in a remote land far from India, a person of low station and a priest of humble learning. During my past lifetimes through the 6 lower paths, I have perhaps at times been born as a great ruler in the human or heavenly worlds, and have bent the multitudes to my will, as a great wind bends the branches of the small trees. And yet at such times I was not able to become a Buddha. I studied the Hinayana and Mahayana sutras, beginning as an ordinary practitioner with no understanding at all, and gradually moved upward to the position of a great bodhisattva. For 1 eon, 2 eons, countless eons I devoted myself to the practices of a bodhisattva, until I had almost reached a state where I could never fail to attain Buddhahood. And yet I was dragged down by the powerful and overwhelming influence of evil, and I never attained Buddhahood. I do not know whether I belong to the third group of those who heard the preachings of the sons of Daitsu Buddha, and yet failed to attain enlightenment even when one son was reborn in the world as Shakyamuni Buddha, or whether I faltered and fell away from the teachings which I heard long before Daitsu Buddha at Gohyaku Jintengo, and thus have been reborn in this form. While one is practicing the teachings of the Lotus Sutra, he may surmount all kinds of difficulties occasioned by the evil forces of the worldly life, or by the persecutions of rulers, heretics, or the followers of the Hinayana Sutras. And yet he may encounter someone like Taocho, Shantao, or Honen, monks who seemed thoroughly conversant with the teachings of the provisional and true Mahayana Sutras, but who were in fact possessed by devils. Such men seem to praise the Lotus Sutra most forcefully, but in fact they belittle the people's ability to understand it, claiming that, quote, its principles are so profound that few can comprehend them, end quote. They mislead others by saying, quote, not a single person has ever attained Buddhahood through that sutra, or not one person in 1,000 can reach enlightenment through its teachings, end quote. Thus, over a period of countless lifetimes, men are deceived more often than there are sand in the Ganges, until they abandon their faith in the Lotus Sutra and descend to the teachings of the provisional Mahayana Sutras, abandon these and descend to the teachings of the Hinayana Sutras, and eventually abandon these and descend to the teachings of the scriptures of the non-Buddhist doctrines. I understand all too well how, in the end, men have come in this way to fall into the evil states of existence. I, Nichiren, am the only person in all Japan who understands this. But if I utter so much as a word concerning it, then parents, brothers, and teachers will surely criticize me, and the government authorities will take steps against me. On the other hand, I am fully aware that if I do not speak out, I will be lacking in compassion. I have considered which course to take in the light of the teachings of the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras. If I remain silent, I may escape harm in this lifetime, but in my next life, I will most certainly fall into the hell of incessant suffering. If I speak out, I am fully aware that I will have to contend with the 3 obstacles and the 4 devils, but of these 2 courses, surely the latter is the one to choose. If I were to falter in my determination in the face of government persecutions, however, I would not be able to fulfill my course. In that case, perhaps it would be better not to speak out. While thinking this over, I recalled the teachings of the Hoto chapter on the 6 difficult and 9 easy acts. Persons like myself, who are of paltry strength, might still be able to lift Mount Sumeru and toss it about. Persons like myself who are lacking in spiritual powers might still shoulder a load of dry grass and yet remain unburdened in the fire at the end of the kalpa of decline. And persons like myself who are without wisdom might still read and memorize as many sutras as there are sands in the Ganges. But such acts are not difficult, we are told, when compared to the difficulty of embracing even one phrase or verse of the Lotus Sutra in the latter day of the law. Nevertheless, I vow to summon up a powerful and unconquerable desire for the salvation of all beings, and never to falter in my efforts. It is already over 20 years since I began proclaiming my doctrines. Day after day, month after month, year after year, I have been subjected to repeated persecutions. Minor persecutions and annoyances are too numerous even to be counted, but the major persecutions number 4. Among the 4, twice I have been subjected to persecutions by the government itself. The most recent one has come near to costing me my life. In addition, my disciples, my lay followers, and even those who have merely listened to my teachings have been subjected to severe punishments and treated as though they were guilty of treason. In the Hoshi chapter of the Lotus Sutra we read, quote, since hatred and jealousy abound even during the lifetime of the Buddha, how much worse will it be in the world after his passing? End quote. The Hiyu chapter states, quote, they will despise, hate, envy, and bear grudges against those who read, recite, transcribe, and embrace this sutra, end quote. And the Arakugyo chapter says, the people will be full of hostility, and it will be extremely difficult to believe, end quote. The Kanji chapter states, quote, there will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us, and they will address the rulers, high ministers, brahmins, and great patrons of Buddhism, slandering and speaking evil of us, saying, these are men of perverted views. end quote. It is also stated in the Kanji chapter, quote, again and again we will be banished, end quote. And in the Fukyo chapter, quote, they would beat him with sticks and staves and stone him with rocks and tiles, end quote. The Nirvana Sutra records, quote, at the time there were a countless number of non-Buddhists who plotted together and went in a group to King Ajatashatru of Magadha and said, at present there is a man of incomparable wickedness, a monk called Gautama. All sorts of evil persons, hoping to gain profit and alms, have flocked to him and become his followers. They do not practice goodness, but instead they use the power of spells and magic to win over men like Mahakasyapa, Shariputra, and Madhyayana. Tiantai says, it will be much worse in the future because the Lotus Sutra is so hard to teach, while Miaolo says, those who have not yet freed themselves from impediments are called hostile ones, and those who take no delight in listening to the doctrine are called jealous ones. The leaders of the 3 southern and 7 northern sects of Buddhism in China, as well as the countless other scholars of China, all regard Tiantai with resentment and animosity. Thus, Tokichi said, see here, Chi-yi, whose disciple are you? With a tongue less than 3 inches long, you slander the teachings that come from the Buddha's long, broad tongue. Priest Chi Tu writes in the book Toshun, quote, someone questioned me, saying, while the Buddha was in the world, there were many who were resentful and jealous of him. But now, in the years after his passing, when we preach the Lotus Sutra, why are there so many who try to make trouble for us? I replied, it is said that good medicine tastes bitter. The sutra, which is like good medicine, dispels attachments to the 5 vehicles and establishes the one supreme teaching. It reproaches common mortals and censures sages, denies Mahayana, and refutes Hinayana. It speaks of the heavenly devils as poisonous insects and calls the heretics evil demons. It censures those who cling to Hinayana beliefs, calling them mean and impoverished, and it diminishes bodhisattvas as beginners in learning. For this reason, heavenly devils hate to listen to it. Heretics find their ears offended. Persons in the Shomon and Ingaku realms are dumbfounded, and bodhisattvas flee in terror. That is why all these types of persons try to make trouble for us. The Buddha was not speaking nonsense when he preached that we would face much hatred and jealousy. End quote. The great teacher Dengyo, in his Kenkai Ron, states, quote, the superintendents of priests in the capital of Nara submitted a memorial to the throne, saying, just as in the western Sia land of Central Asia, there was an evil Brahmin named Devil Eloquence who deceived people. So now, in this eastern realm of Japan, there is a shave-pated monk who spits out crafty words. Creatures like this will attract to themselves those who are of like mind and will deceive and mislead the world. I replied to these charges by saying, just as in the Qi dynasty of China, we heard of the superintendent of priests, Hui Kuang, who arrogantly attacked Tiantai. So now in our own country, we see these 6 superintendents of priests who oppose me. How true was the Buddha's prediction that after his death, his followers would face greater opposition than ever? End quote. In the Hokkei Shuku, the great teacher Dengyo also says, quote, the propagation of the true teaching will begin in the age when the middle day of the law ends and the latter day opens, in a land to the east of Tang and to the west of Katsu. Among people stained by the 5 impurities who live in a time of conflict, the sutra says, since hate and jealousy abound even during the lifetime of the Buddha, how much worse will it be in the world after his passing? There is good reason for this statement. End quote. When a little boy is given moxibustion treatment, he will hate his mother for a time. When a seriously ill person is given good medicine, he will complain without fail about its bitterness. And we meet the similar complaints about the Lotus Sutra, even in the lifetime of the Buddha. How much more severe is the opposition after his passing, especially in the middle and latter days of the law, and in a far-off country like Japan? As mountains pile upon mountains and waves follow waves, so do persecutions after persecutions, and criticisms augment criticisms. During the middle day of the law, one man alone, the great teacher Tiantai, understood and expounded the Lotus Sutra and the other sutras. The other Buddhist leaders of both northern and southern China hated him for it, but the 2 wise sovereigns, Emperor Wen of the Chen dynasty and Emperor Yang of the Sui, gave him an audience to establish the correctness of his views and debate with his opponents. Thus, in time, he ceased to have any more opponents. At the end of the middle day of the law, one man alone, the great teacher Dengyo, knew how to expound the Lotus Sutra and the other sutras in the same manner as the Buddha himself. The 7 great temples of Nara rose up like hornets against him, but the 2 wise sovereigns, Emperor Kamu and Emperor Saga, gave him the opportunity to make clear the correctness of his views, and thereafter there was no further trouble. It is now over 200 years since the latter day of the law began. The Buddha predicted that conditions would be much worse after his passing, and we see the portents of this in the quarrels and wranglings that go on today because unreasonable doctrines are prevalent. And as proof of the fact that we are living in the age of chaos and confusion, the contestants in these doctrinal debates are not called together so that they may settle the matter fairly, but instead I am sent into exile, and my very life is imperiled. When it comes to understanding the Lotus Sutra, I have only a minute fraction of the vast ability that Tiantai and Dengyo possessed. But in my ability to endure persecution and the wealth of my compassion for others, I believe I would put them to shame. As a votary of the Lotus Sutra, I firmly believe that I will come under the protection of the gods, and yet I do not see the slightest sign of this. On the contrary, I fall under growing accusations for the crimes I am said to commit. In view of this, I am perhaps then not a votary of the Lotus Sutra after all? Or have the numerous benevolent deities of heaven who vowed to protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra perhaps taken leave and departed from this land of Japan? I find myself in much perplexity. But then I recall the 20 lines of verse in the Kanji chapter of the 5th volume of the Lotus Sutra, in which the 80 myriads of millions of Nayutas of Bodhisattvas describe the persecutions they will endure after the Buddha's death for the sake of the Lotus Sutra. If I, Nichiren, had not been born in this land of Japan, then the words of the Buddha predicting such persecutions would have been a great prevarication, and those countless bodhisattvas would have been guilty of the same crime as that of Devadatta, of lying and misleading others. The Kanji chapter says, quote, "There will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us, and will attack us with swords and staves, and rocks and tiles," end quote. Look around you in the world today. Are there any monks other than Nichiren who are cursed and vilified because of the Lotus Sutra, or who are attacked with swords and staves? If it were not for Nichiren, the prophecy made in this verse of the sutra would have been sheer falsehood. The same passage says, quote, "There will be monks in that evil age with perverse views and hearts that are fawning and crooked," end quote. And, quote, "They will preach the Dharma to white-robed laymen and will be respected and revered by the world as though they were arhats who possess the 6 supernatural powers," end quote. If it were not for the teachers of the Nembutsu, Zen, and Ritsu sects of our present age, then Shakyamuni Buddha, who uttered these prophecies in the sutra, would have been a teller of great untruths. The passage likewise says, quote, "Constantly going about among the populace, they will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and great patrons of Buddhism, slandering and speaking evil of us," end quote. If the monks of today did not slander me to the authorities and condemn me to banishment, then this passage in the sutra would have remained unfulfilled. "Again and again we will be banished," says the sutra. But if Nichiren had not been banished time and again for the sake of the Lotus Sutra, what would these words "again and again" have meant? Even Tiantai and Dengyo were not able to fulfill this prediction. That they would be banished again and again, much less was anyone else. But because I have been born at the beginning of the latter day of the law, the fearful and evil age described in the sutra, I alone have been able to live these words. As other examples of prophecies that were fulfilled, in the Fuhozo Sutra, it is recorded that Shakyamuni Buddha said, 100 years after my passing, a ruler known as the Great King Ashoka will appear. In the Maya Sutra, he said, 600 years after my passing, a man named Bodhisattva Nagarjuna will appear in southern India. And in the Daihi Sutra, he said, 60 years after my passing, a man named Madhya Tinka would establish his base in the Dragon Palace. All of these prophecies came true. Indeed, if they had not, who would have faith in the Buddhist sutras? Thus, the Buddha decided the time when the votary of the Lotus Sutra should appear, describing it as a fearful and evil age, a latter age when the law will disappear in the final 500 years, as attested by both the 2 Chinese versions of the Lotus Sutra, Shōho Kekkyo and Myoho Renge Kyo. At such a time, if the 3 powerful enemies predicted in the Lotus Sutra did not appear, then who would have faith in the words of the Buddha? If it were not for Nichiren, who could fulfill the Buddha's prophecies concerning the votary of the Lotus Sutra? 3 sects of southern China and 7 sects of northern China, along with the 7 great temples of Nara, are numbered among the enemies of the Lotus Sutra in the time of the middle day of the law. And if that is so, then how could the Zen, Ritsu, and Nembutsu priests of the present time hope to escape a similar label? With this body of mine, I have fulfilled the prophecies of the sutra. The more the government authorities rage against me, the greater is my joy. For instance, there are certain Hinayana bodhisattvas who, having not yet freed themselves from delusion, voluntarily choose to be born in evil circumstances so they may help others. In order to accomplish this, they will create bad karma that they have no desire to create. Thus, if one of them sees his mother and his father have fallen into hell and are suffering greatly, he will deliberately create the appropriate karma in hopes that he too may fall into hell and share their suffering. To suffer for the sake of others is a joy to him. It is the same with me in fulfilling the prophecies. Though at present I must face trials that I can scarcely endure, I rejoice when I think that in the future I will escape being born into an evil state of existence. And yet the people doubt me, and I too have doubts about myself. Why do the gods not assist me? The various guardian deities of heaven made their vow before the Buddha. Even if the votary of the Lotus Sutra were an ape rather than a man, if he announced that he was a votary of the Lotus Sutra, then I believe the gods would rush forward to fulfill the vow they made before the Buddha. Does their failure to do so mean I am, in fact, not a votary of the Lotus Sutra? This doubt lies at the heart of this piece I am writing. And because it is the most important concern of my entire life, I will raise it again and again here and emphasize it more than ever before I attempt to answer it. Prince Chicha, with his heart, had promised to give the Lord of Tsu the precious royal sword that he wore. Therefore, when he later found that the Lord of Tsu had died, he placed the sword on his grave. Wang Shou, having drunk water from a river, carefully tossed a gold coin into the water as payment. Hun Yen, finding that his lord had been killed, cut open his stomach and inserted his lord's liver into it before he died. These were worthy men, and they knew how to fulfill their obligations. How much more so, then, should this be the case with great sages like Shariputra and Mahakasyapa, who observed every one of the 250 precepts and the 3,000 rules of conduct, and had cut themselves off from the illusions of thought and desire, and separated themselves from the threefold world. They are worthy to be teachers of Bonten, Taishaku, and the other gods of heaven, and the eyes of the multitude. During the first 40 or more years of the Buddha's preaching, these men, because they belonged to the Shomon and Engaku realms, were disliked and pushed aside with admonitions that they could never attain Buddhahood. But when they had tasted the medicine of immortality in the Lotus Sutra, they were like scorched seeds that sprout, a shattered rock joined together again, or withered trees that put forth blossoms and fruit. Through the Lotus Sutra, it was revealed that they would attain Buddhahood after all, though they had yet to enter the 8 phases of a Buddha's existence. Why, then, do they not do something to repay their obligation to the sutra? If they do not do so, they will show themselves to be inferior to the worthy men I have mentioned earlier, and in fact be no more than animals who have no understanding of obligation. The turtle that Mao Pao saved did not forget to repay the obligation of the past. The great fish of the Kunming Pond, in order to repay the man who had saved his life, presented a bright pearl in the middle of the night. Even these creatures understood how to fulfill their obligations, so why shouldn't men who are great sages? Ananda was a second son of King Dronodana, and Rahula was the grandson of King Shuddhodana. Both men were born into very distinguished families, but because they had attained the level of Arhat, they were prevented from ever reaching Buddhahood. And yet, during the 8-year assembly at Eagle Peak, when the Lotus Sutra was preached, it was revealed that Ananda would become the Mountain Sea Wisdom Unrestricted Power King Buddha, and that Rahula would become the Buddha stepping on 7 treasure flowers. No matter what great sages these men were, or how distinguished their families, if it had not been for the revelation in the Lotus Sutra, who would have paid respect to them? King Chie of the Xia dynasty and King Chao of the Yin dynasty were lords of an army of 10,000 chariots and commanded the allegiance of the entire populace of their kingdoms. But because they governed despotically and brought about the downfall of their dynasties, people speak of Chie and Chou as the epitome of evil men. Even a beggar or leper, if he is likened to Chie or Chou, will become enraged at the insult. Thus we see that power and position alone do not necessarily ensure that one will be respected. If it had not been for the Lotus Sutra, then who would ever have heard of the 1200 Shomon, and the countless other Shomon who would attain Buddhahood through the Sutra, and who would have listened to their voices? No one would have read the Buddhist sutras compiled by the 1,000 Shomon disciples, nor would there be any paintings or statues of them set up and worshipped. It is entirely due to the power of the Lotus Sutra that these arhats were revered and followed. If these Shomon were to separate themselves from the Lotus Sutra, they would be like fish without water, a monkey without a tree, a baby without the breast, or a people without a ruler. Why then do they abandon the votary of the Lotus Sutra? In the sutras that precede the Lotus Sutra, the Shomon are depicted as acquiring the heavenly eye and the wisdom eye in addition to their physical eyes. In the Lotus Sutra, we are told that they are also provided with the Dharma eye and the Buddha eye. Their eyesight can penetrate any of the worlds in the 10 directions. How then could they fail to see me, the votary of the Lotus Sutra, right here in the Saha world? Even if I were an evil man who had said a word or two against them, or even if I cursed and reviled the Shomon for a year or two, a kalpa or two, or a countless number of kalpas, and went so far as to threaten to take up swords and staves against them, so long as I maintain my faith in the Lotus Sutra and act as its votary, then they should never abandon me. A child may curse his parents, but would the parents for that reason cast him aside? The young owls eat their mother, but the mother nevertheless does not abandon them. The hake beast kills its father, but the father does nothing to prevent this. If even animals behave like this, then why should great sages like the Shomon abandon the votary of the Lotus Sutra? The 4 great Shomon disciples of the Buddha, in the passage that deals with their belief and understanding, proclaimed, quote, "Now we have become true Shomon, for we take the voice, Sho, of the Buddha's way, and cause it to be heard, Mon, among all beings. Now we have become true arhats, for among all the gods, men, demons, and Baltens of the various worlds, everywhere in their midst we deserve to receive offerings. The Buddha, in his great beneficence, makes use of a rare thing, to comfort and teach us and bestow benefit upon us. And countless millions of kalpas, who could ever repay him, though men offer him their hands and feet, bow their heads to the ground in obeisance, and present him with all manner of alms, none of them could repay him. Should they bear him on the crown of their heads or carry him on their 2 shoulders through kalpas numerous as sands of the Ganges, exhausting their hearts in reverence, should they offer him delicious foods, numberless jeweled garments and articles of bedding, potions and medicines of every kind, should they use ox head, sandalwood, and all kinds of rare gems to erect a stupa shrine, spreading jeweled garments over the ground, should they perform these acts and use these things as offerings through kalpas numerous as sands of the Ganges, still they could never repay him." End quote. In the various sutras preached during the earlier period of the Buddha's life, which have been compared to 4 inferior flavors, the Shoman disciples were depicted on countless occasions as subjected to all kinds of abuse and shamed before the great assembly of human and heavenly beings. Thus we are told that the sound of Mahakasyapa's weeping and wailing echoed through the entire universe. That Subhuti was so dumbfounded that he almost went off and left the alms bowl that he had been carrying. That Shariputra spat out the food he was eating, and that Purna was berated for being the kind who would put filth in a precious jar. When the Buddha was at Deer Park, he extolled the Agon Sutras and enjoined men to observe the 250 precepts, warmly praising those who did so. Yet before long, as we have seen, he turned about and began condemning such men. He is guilty, we would have to say, of making 2 different and completely contradictory pronouncements. Thus, for example, the Buddha cursed his disciple Devadatta, saying, quote, "You are a fool who licks the spit of others," end quote. Devadatta felt as though a poisoned arrow had been shot into his breast, and he cried out in anger, saying, "Gautama is no Buddha. I am the eldest son of King Dranodana, the elder brother of Ananda, and the cousin of Gautama. No matter what kind of evil conduct I might be guilty of, he ought to admonish me in private for it. But to publicly accuse me of faults in front of this great assembly of human and heavenly beings, is this a behavior appropriate to a great man or a Buddha? He showed himself to be my enemy in the past when he stole the woman I intended to marry, and he has shown himself my enemy at this gathering today. From this day forward, I vow to look upon him as my greatest enemy for lifetime after lifetime and age after age to come." End quote. After we stop to consider, we note that of the Shoman disciples, some were originally from Brahmin families who followed non-Buddhist doctrines, or were leaders of various non-Buddhist sects who had converted kings to their teachings and were looked up to by their followers. Others were men of aristocratic families or the possessors of great wealth, but they abandoned their exalted positions in life, lowering the banners of their pride, casting off everyday clothing, and wrapping their bodies in the humble, dingy-hued robes of a Buddhist monk. They threw away their white fly whisks, their bows and arrows, and took up a solitary alms bowl, becoming like paupers and beggars and following the Buddha. They had no dwellings to protect them from the wind and rain, and very little in the way of food or clothing by which to sustain life. Moreover, all the people of the 5 regions of India and the 4 seas were disciples or supporters of the non-Buddhist religions, so that even the Buddha himself was on 9 occasions forced to suffer major hardships. Thus, for example, Devadatta hurled a great stone at him, King Ajatashatru loosed a wild elephant on him, and King Ajita for a period of 90 days would give him and his followers nothing but horse fodder to eat. At a Brahman city, he was offered stinking rice gruel, and a Brahman woman named Chinchamanavika, tying a bolt to her belly, claimed to be pregnant with his child. Needless to say, the Buddhist disciples were likewise forced to suffer frequent hardships. Thus, numerous members of the Shakya clan were killed by King Virudaka, and countless of the Buddha's followers were trampled to death by wild elephants that were set upon them. The nun Utpalarvana was killed by Devadatta. The disciple Kalodayan was buried and horse-dung, and the disciple Madhyayana was beaten to death by a Brahman named Chikujo. In addition, the 6 non-Buddhist teachers banded together and slandered the Buddha before King Ajatashatru and King Prasenajit, saying, "Gautama is the most evil man in the whole continent of Jambudvipa. Wherever he may be, his presence heralds the onset of the 3 calamities and the 7 disasters. As the numerous rivers gather together in the great sea and the groves of trees cluster on the great mountains, so do crowds of evil men gather around Gautama. The men called Mahakasyapa, Shariputra, and Madhyayana and Subhuti are examples. All those who are born in human form should place loyalty to the sovereign and filial piety above all else, but these men have been so misled by Gautama that they disregard the teachings of their parents, abandon their families, and defying the commandments of the king, go to live in the mountain forests. They should be expelled from this country. It is because they are allowed to remain that the sun, moon, and stars manifest sinister phenomenon, and many strange happenings occur in the land." End quote. The Shoman disciples did not know how they could possibly bear this slander. Then, as if to add to their hardship, the Buddha himself began to denounce them. They found it difficult to follow him, now and then hearing him condemn them in great assemblies of human and heavenly beings, and not knowing how to behave, they only became more confused. On top of all of this, they had to face the greatest hardship of all, as revealed in the Vimalakirti Sutra, when the Buddha addressed the Shoman disciples saying, quote, Those who give alms to you are cultivating for themselves no field of fortune. Those who give support to you will instead fall into the three evil paths." End quote. According to this passage, these words were spoken in the garden of Ambapali in the city of Vaisali. There, Bonten, Taishaku, the deities of the sun and moon, the four heavenly kings, and the various gods of the threefold world, along with earth gods, dragon gods, and other beings as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, had gathered in a great assembly. When the Buddha said, quote, "The humans and heavenly beings who give alms to Subhuti and the other monks will fall into the three evil paths," end quote, after the human and heavenly beings had heard this, would they be likely to go on giving alms to the Shoman disciples? It would almost appear as though the Buddha were deliberately attempting through his words to inflict death upon those who were in the two realms of Shoman and Hingaku. The more sensible persons in the assembly were no doubt repelled by the Buddha's actions. Nevertheless, the Shoman disciples were able to obtain enough of the alms given to the Buddha to keep themselves alive, meager though the amount was. When I consider the situation, it occurs to me that if the Buddha had passed away before preaching the various sutras delivered in the first 40 or more years of his career, and had never lived to preach the Lotus Sutra in the later 8 years, then who would ever have offered alms to these Shoman disciples? They would by now have fallen into the realm of hunger. But after more than 40 years of preaching various sutras, it was as though the bright spring sun appeared to melt the frigid ice, or a great wind arose to dispel the dew from the countless grasses. With one remark, in one moment the Buddha wiped away his earlier pronouncement, saying, "I have not yet revealed the truth." Like a great wind scattering the dark clouds, or the full moon in the vast heavens, or like the sun shining in the blue sky, he proclaimed, "The world-honored one has long expounded his doctrines, and now must reveal the truth." With the brilliance of the sun or the brightness of the moon, it was revealed in the Lotus Sutra that Shariputra would become flower-light Tathagata, and Mahakasyapa would become the light-bright Tathagata. Because of the Lotus Sutra, which is a phoenix among writings, a mirror or a diviner's tortoise shell, after the Buddha's passing, these Shoman disciples were looked up to by the human and heavenly supporters of Buddhism as though they were actual Buddhas. If the water is clear, then the moon will not fail to be reflected there. If the wind blows, then the grass and trees will not fail to bow before it. And if there is a true votary of the Lotus Sutra, then the sages, the Shoman disciples, should not fail to go to his side, though they might have to pass through a great fire to do so, or make their way through a great rock. Though Mahakasyapa may be deep in meditation, does he intend to do nothing about this situation? I am completely perplexed. Is it not the period of the fifth 500 years? Is the prediction about worldwide Kosen Rufu mere nonsense? Is Nichiren not the votary of the Lotus Sutra? Are the Shoman disciples protecting those who disparage the Lotus Sutra as our written teaching and who put forth their great lies about what they call a special transmission? Are they guarding those who write discard, close, ignore, abandon, urging men to put an end to the teachings of the Lotus Sutra and to throw away the texts, and who cause the ruin of the temples where they are taught? The Shoman disciples and the various deities of heaven swore before the Buddha to protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra, but now that they see how fierce are the great persecutions of this age of chaos, have they decided to withhold their aid? The sun and the moon are still up in the sky. Mount Sumeru has not collapsed. The sea tides ebb and flow, and the four seasons proceed in their normal order. Why, then, is there no sign of aid for the votary of the Lotus Sutra? My doubt grows deeper than ever. In the sutras preached before the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha is shown predicting the various great bodhisattvas and heavenly and human beings will attain Buddhahood in the future. But trying to realize such predictions is like trying to grasp the moon in the water, like mistaking the reflection for the actual object. It has the color and shape of the object, but not the reality. Likewise, the Buddha would seem to be displaying profound kindness in making such predictions, but in fact it is little kindness at all. When Shakyamuni had first attained enlightenment and had not yet begun to preach, more than 60 great bodhisattvas, including Dharma Wisdom, Force of Merits, Diamond Pennant, and Diamond Storehouse, appeared from the various Buddha lands of the 10 directions and came before the Buddha. There, at the request of the Bodhisattva Chief Wise, Moon of Deliverance, and others, they preached the doctrines of the 10 stages of security, the 10 stages of practice, the 10 stages of devotion, the 10 stages of development, etc. The doctrines that these great bodhisattvas preached were not learned from Shakyamuni Buddha. At that time, Bonten and other deities of the world of the 10 directions came together and preached the Dharma. But again, it was not something they had learned from Shakyamuni. These great bodhisattvas, deities, dragons, etc., who appeared at the assembly described in the Keigon Sutra were beings who had attained the stage of Fushigi enlightenment in the period before Shakyamuni. Perhaps they were disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha when he was carrying out bodhisattva practices in previous incarnations, or perhaps they were disciples of previous Buddhas of the worlds of the 10 directions. In any event, they were not disciples of the Shakyamuni who was born in India and who had attained enlightenment at the age of 30. It was only when the Buddha set forth the 4 types of teachings in the Agon, Hodo, and Hanya Sutras that he finally acquired disciples. And although there were doctrines preached by the Buddha himself, they were not his own. Why do I say this? Because the Bekkyo and Ingyo, the 2 higher types of teachings as set forth in the Hodo and Hanya Sutras, do not differ in meaning from the Bekkyo and Ingyo set forth in the Kegon Sutra. The Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings given in the Kegon Sutra are not the Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. They are the Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings of Hoe, or Dharma wisdom, and the other great bodhisattvas mentioned earlier. These great bodhisattvas may appear to most people to have been disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha, but in fact it would be better to call them his teachers. Shakyamuni listened to these bodhisattvas preaching, and after gaining wisdom and understanding, proceeded to set forth the Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings of the Hodo and Hanya Sutras. But these differ in no way from the Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings of the Kegon Sutra. Therefore, we know that these bodhisattvas were the teachers of Shakyamuni. These bodhisattvas are mentioned in the Kegon Sutra, where they are called Zenchi Shiki, or men of good influence. To call a person Zenchi Shiki means that he is neither one's teacher nor one's disciple. The 2 types of teachings called Zokyo and Sugyo are offshoots of the Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings. Anyone who understands the Bekkyo and Ingyo teachings will invariably understand the Zokyo and Tsugyo teachings as well. A teacher is someone who teaches his disciple things that they did not previously know. For example, in the ages before the Buddha, the heavenly and human beings and followers of non-Buddhist religions were all disciples of the 2 deities and the 3 ascetics. Though their doctrines branched off to form 95 different schools, they all remained faithful to the views of the 3 ascetics. Shakyamuni also studied these doctrines and for a time became a disciple of the non-Buddhist teachers. But after spending 12 years in various difficult and easy practices, he came to understand the principles of suffering, emptiness, impermanence, and non-ego. Therefore, he ceased to call himself a disciple of the non-Buddhist teachings and instead proclaimed himself the possessor of a wisdom acquired from no teacher at all. Thus, in time, the heavenly and human beings came to look upon him as a great teacher. It is clear, therefore, that during the first 40 or more years of his preaching career, the so-called period of the 4 flavors, Shakyamuni Buddha was a disciple of Hoe and the other great bodhisattvas. Similarly, he was the 9th disciple of Bodhisattva Monju. This is also the reason why the Buddha repeatedly declares in the earlier sutras, "I have never preached a single word." When Shakyamuni Buddha was 72, he preached the Muryogi Sutra on Eagle Peak in the kingdom of Magadha. At that time, he denied all the sutras he had preached during the previous more than 40 years and all the fragmentary teachings derived from those sutras, saying, quote, "In these more than 40 years, I have not yet revealed the truth," end quote. At that time, the great bodhisattvas and the various heavenly and human beings hastened to gather around and implore the Buddha to reveal the true doctrine. In fact, in the Muryogi Sutra, he mentioned one teaching that appeared to be true, but he did not elaborate on it. It is like the moment when the moon is about to rise. The moon is still hidden behind the eastern hills, and though its glow begins to light the western hills, people cannot yet see the body of the moon itself. In the Hoben chapter of the Lotus Sutra, when the Buddha first briefly explained why the 3 vehicles should be rejected and the supreme vehicle embraced, he also briefly explained the concept of Ichinen Sanzen, speaking the true thoughts that were in his mind. But because this was the first time he had touched on the subject, it was only dimly apprehended, like the first note of the cuckoo heard by someone drowsy with sleep, or like the moon appearing over the rim of the hill but veiled by thin clouds. Shariputra and the others, startled, called the deities, dragon gods, and great bodhisattvas together, begging for instruction. As the sutra says, quote, "The various deities and dragon gods were numberless as the seas of the Ganges, and various bodhisattvas seeking to be Buddhas were great in number, 80,000. And from the myriads of millions of lands, the wheel-turning kings arrived, with palms pressed together and reverent minds, all wished to hear the teaching of perfect endowment," end quote. The passage indicates that the persons requested to hear a doctrine such as they had not heard in the previous more than 40 years, one that differed from the 4 flavors in the 3 teachings. With regard to the line, quote, "They wish to hear the teaching of perfect endowment," end quote, it may be noted that the Nirvana Sutra states, quote, "Sad indicates perfect endowment," end quote. The Daijo Shinran Genkiki states, quote, "Sad connotes 6. In India, the number 6 implies perfect endowment," end quote. In his annotations on the Lotus Sutra, Chia Xiang writes, quote, "Sad means perfect endowment," end quote. In the 8th volume of his Hokke Gengi, Tiantai remarks, quote, "Sad is a Sanskrit word which is translated as myo," end quote. Bodhisattva Nagarjuna, in the heart of his 1000 volume Daichiro Ron, comments, "Sad signifies 6. Nagarjuna was 13th in the lineage of the Buddha's successors, the founder of the Shingon, Kegon, and other sects. a great sage who had ascended to the 41st stage of Bodhisattva practice and whose true identity was the Tathagata Hon Jizao. The title Myoho Renge Kyo is of course Chinese. In India, the Lotus Sutra is called Saddharma Pundarika Sutra. The following is the mantra concerning the heart of the Lotus Sutra, composed by Shanwu Wei. No Maku Samanda Bodhanan. Hail to the Universal Buddha. On, the three-bodied Tathagata. Anaku, who opens, shows, enlightens, causes us to enter. Saruba Bodha, all the Buddhas. Kino, wisdom and. Saki Shubhya, understanding. Gyagya no Samsoba, so that we understand the empty nature. Arakishani, and display departure from defilement. Satsuri Dharma, the correct Dharma. Pundarikya, white lotus. Sotaran, sutra. Ja, enters. Un, everywhere. Ban, causing us to dwell. Koku, enjoy. Bazara, with steadfast. Araki shaman, protection. Un, void, without form, without desire. Sohaka, absolutely achieved. This mantra, which expresses the heart of the Lotus Sutra, was found in the Iron Tower in southern India. In this mantra, the word Satsuri Dharma means correct Dharma. Satsu means show, correct. Sho is the same as myo, mystic. Myo is the same as sho. Shohoke is the same as myohoke. And when the two syllables namu are prefixed to the title Myoho Renge Kyo, we have the formula Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Myo means gusoku, or perfect endowment. 6 refers to the 6 types of practices leading to perfection. When the persons ask to hear the teaching of perfect endowment, they are asking how they may gain the perfect endowment of the 6 practices of the Bodhisattvas. In the word gusoku, the element gu, possession, refers to mutual possession of the 10 worlds, while the element soku, perfect, means that since there is mutual possession of the 10 worlds, then any one world contains all the other worlds, indicating that this is perfect. This Lotus Sutra is a single work consisting of 8 volumes, 28 chapters, and 69,384 characters. To each and every character is attached the word myo or mystic, making it a Buddha endowed with the 32 distinguishing features and 80 physical characteristics. Each of the 10 worlds manifests its own Buddha nature. As Miyaolo writes, quote, "If even a Buddha nature is present in all the 10 worlds, then all the other worlds will of course be present too." According to the Hoben chapter, the Buddha replied to the request of his listeners by saying, quote, "I wish to open the door of Buddha wisdom to all beings," end quote. The term all beings here refers to Shariputra, and it also refers to men of incorrigible disbelief. It also refers to the 9 worlds, thus fulfilling the words of the Buddha. All beings are numberless. I vow to save them, as the Buddha says in the Hoben chapter. Quote, "At the start, I pledged to make all people perfectly equal to me without any distinction between us. By now, the original vows that I made have already been fulfilled." End quote. All the great Bodhisattvas, heavenly beings, and others, when they had heard the doctrine of the Buddha and comprehended it, said, quote, "From past times we have heard the world-honored one preach on various occasions. We have never heard anything to match the profoundness and wonder of this superior Dharma." End quote. The great teacher Dengyo comments, quote, "From past times we have heard the world-honored one preach on various occasions," refers to the fact that they had heard him preach the great doctrines of the Kegon Sutra and other sutras in the time previous to the preaching of the Lotus Sutra. "We have never heard anything to match the profoundness and wonder of this superior Dharma" means that they had never heard the doctrine of the unique, supreme vehicle propounded in the Lotus Sutra. End quote. They understood, that is, that none of the previous Mahayana sutras such as the Kegon, Hodo, Hanya, Jimitsu, and Dainichi, which are numerous as the sands of the Ganges, had ever made clear the great principle of Ichinen Sanzen, which is the core of all the teachings of the Buddha's lifetime, or the bone and marrow of those teachings, the doctrines that those in the 2 realms of Shoman and Engaku shall achieve Buddhahood, and that the Buddha attained enlightenment countless eons ago. Part 2. From this time forward, the great Bodhisattvas, as well as Bonten, Taishaku, the gods of the sun and moon, and the 4 heavenly kings, became the disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha. Thus, in the Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha treats these great Bodhisattvas as his disciples, admonishing and instructing them in these words, quote, "I say to the great assembly, after I have passed away, who can protect and maintain, read, and recite this sutra? Now, in the presence of the Buddha, let him come forward and speak his vow." End quote. This was the solemn way he addressed them, and the great Bodhisattvas in turn were, in the words of the sutra, quote, "like the branches of small trees when a great wind blows them." End quote. Like the kusha grass, bending before a great wind, or like rivers and streams drawn to the great ocean, so were they drawn to the Buddha. But it was still a relatively short time since the Buddha had begun to preach the Lotus Sutra on Eagle Peak, and what he said seemed to his listeners dreamlike and unreal. The treasure tower had first appeared to confirm the correctness of the theoretical teaching in the first part of the Lotus Sutra, and after that, the treasure tower prepared the way for the expounding of the essential teaching. The Buddhas of the 10 directions gathered in assembly, Shakyamuni Buddha announcing that all of these are emanations of my being. The treasure tower hung in the air, with Shakyamuni and Taho seated side by side in it, as though both the sun and the moon had appeared side by side in the blue sky. The great assembly of human and heavenly beings were ranged about the sky like stars, and the Buddhas who were emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha were on the ground, seated on their lion king thrones under jewel trees. In the Lotus Treasury world described in the Kegon Sutra, Buddhas in their property of wisdom aspect all dwell in their separate lands. Buddhas of other worlds do not come to the present world and call themselves emanations of Shakyamuni, as happened in the case of the Lotus Sutra. Nor do Buddhas of this world go to other worlds. Only Hoei and the others of the 4 Bodhisattvas come and go. As for the 9 honored ones of the 8 petals and the 37 honored ones described in the Dainichi and Kongocho Sutras, although they appear to be incarnations of the Buddha Dainichi or Mahavajrayana, they are not dignified Buddhas who possess all the 3 properties of a true Buddha. The 1,000 Buddhas described in the Daibon Hanya Sutra and the Buddhas of the 6 directions represented in the Amida Sutra never assembled in this world, as did the Buddha's emanations in the Lotus Sutra. The Buddhas who are described in the Daijuku Sutra as assembling in this world, on the other hand, were not emanations of Shakyamuni. Similarly, the 4 Buddhas of the 4 directions depicted in the Konko-myo Sutra are merely their own incarnations. Thus, in the various sutras other than the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni does not assemble Buddhas who carry out different austerities and practices and who possess the 3 properties of a true Buddha, nor does he identify them as emanations of himself. Only in the Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra does he do so. This chapter, then, is intended as an introduction to the Juryo chapter that follows later. Shakyamuni Buddha, who we believed had attained enlightenment for the first time only some 40 or more years previously, calls together Buddhas who had become enlightened as long ago as 1 or even 10 eons in the past, and declares that they are emanations of himself. This is a far cry indeed from the Buddha's usual preachings on the equality of all Buddhas, and in fact a cause for great astonishment. If Shakyamuni had attained enlightenment for the first time only some 40 years earlier, there could hardly have been so many beings in the 10 directions who had received his instruction. And even if he was privileged to possess emanations, there would have been no benefit in showing them to his listeners. Tiantai, describing what went on in the astonished minds of the assembly, says, quote, "It was evident to them that Shakyamuni Buddha possessed numerous emanations, therefore they understand that he must have attained enlightenment in the far distant past." End quote. In addition, the multitude of great bodhisattvas of the earth appeared, rising out of the ground. Even Fugen and Monju, the leading disciples of Shakyamuni, could not compare to them. The great bodhisattvas described in the assemblies in the Kegon, Hodo, and Hanya Sutras in the Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra, or Kongo-sata and the others of the 16 great bodhisattvas of the Dainichi Sutra, when compared with these newly arrived bodhisattvas, seemed like a pack of apes or monkeys, with the new bodhisattvas appearing among them like so many taishakus. It was as though great ministers of court should mingle with humble mountain folk. Even Miroku, who was to be the next Buddha after Shakyamuni, was perplexed by them, to say nothing of the lesser personages in the assembly. Among these innumerable great bodhisattvas, there were 4 great sages called Jogyo, Buhengyo, Jyogyo, and Anryu-gyo. In the presence of these 4, the other bodhisattvas suspended in the air or seated on Eagle Peak could not bear to gaze on them face to face, or try to match the workings of their minds. Even the 4 bodhisattvas of the Kegon Sutra, the 4 bodhisattvas of the Dainichi Sutra, or the 16 great bodhisattvas of the Kongocho Sutra, when in the presence of these 4, were like bleary-eyed men trying to peer at the sun, or like humble fishermen appearing in audience before the emperor. These 4 were like Tai Kung Wang and the others of the 4 sages of ancient China, who towered above the multitude. They were like the 4 white-haired recluses of Mount Shang, who assisted Emperor Hui of the Han Dynasty. Solemn, dignified, they were beings of great and lofty stature. Aside from Shakyamuni Buddha, Taho Buddha, and the emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha from the 10 directions, they were worthy of acting as teachers to all beings. Then, Bodhisattva Miroku began to consider the matter in his mind. He said to himself, quote, "Since Shakyamuni Buddha was a crown prince, and during the 42 years since he had gained enlightenment at the age of 30 up until this gathering on Eagle Peak, I have known all the bodhisattvas of this world. and all the great bodhisattvas that have come from the worlds of the 10 directions to attend this assembly. Moreover, I have visited all the pure and impure lands of the 10 directions, sometimes as the Buddha's emissary, at other times on my own initiative, and I have become acquainted with all the great bodhisattvas of those various countries. Now, who are these great bodhisattvas who have appeared from the earth, and what kind of Buddha is their teacher? Surely he must be a Buddha who surpasses even Shakyamuni, Tahoe, and the emanations from the 10 directions. From the violence of the rain, you can judge the greatness of the dragon that caused it to fall. From the size of the lotus flower, you can tell the depth of the pond that produced it. Now, from what country did these great bodhisattvas come? Under what Buddha did they study? And what great dharma do they practice? End quote. Thus did Miraku wonder to himself, becoming so puzzled that he was unable to utter a sound. But perhaps through the Buddha's power, he was at least able to put his doubts into words, saying, quote, "The incalculable thousands of myriads of millions of bodhisattvas in the great multitude such as the past has never seen. This great, majestic, vigorously advancing multitude of bodhisattvas, who preached the Dharma for their sake, instructed them and leading them to their present state. As whose followers did they first turn to the way? What Buddhist teachings do they proclaim? World-honored one, from past times I have never seen their like. I beg you to explain where they come from, the name of their land. Though I am constantly visiting other countries, I have never seen the likes of them. Within all this multitude, I do not recognize a single person. Suddenly they have come out of the ground. I beg you to explain the reason." End quote. Tiantai comments on this, quote, "From the time immediately after his enlightenment, when Shakyamuni preached the Kegon Sutra up until the present gathering on Eagle Peak, bodhisattvas had continuously come from the 10 directions to gather in assembly. Their numbers were unlimited, but Miraku, with the wisdom and power appropriate to the Buddha's successor-to-be, has seen and come to know them all. And yet among the newly arrived multitude he did not recognize a single person. This in spite of the fact that he had traveled in the 10 directions, had served various Buddhas, and was well known among the multitude." End quote. Miao Lo comments, quote, "Wise men can see omens and what they foretell, as snakes know the way of snakes." End quote. The meaning of these passages of scripture and commentary is perfectly clear. In effect, from the time of Shakyamuni's enlightenment up until the assembly on Eagle Peak, in all the lands of the 10 directions, no one had ever seen or heard of beings such as these bodhisattvas that came forth from the earth. The Buddhas, replying to Miraku's doubts, said, quote, "Ajita, these persons whom you and the others have never seen before, they are bodhisattvas, whom I converted and guided after I had attained supreme enlightenment in this Saha world. I tamed their hearts and caused them to develop a longing for the way." End quote. He also said, quote, "When I was in the city of Gaya, seated beneath the Bodhi tree, I attained the highest form of enlightenment and turned the wheel of unparalleled law. Thereafter I taught them and caused them for the first time to aspire to enlightenment. And now all dwell in the stage where they will never backslide. Ever since the long distant past, I have been teaching and guiding the members of this multitude." End quote. But Miraku and the other great bodhisattvas were further perplexed by these words of the Buddha. When the Buddha preached the Kegon Sutra, Hoe and countless other great bodhisattvas appeared in the assembly. Miraku and the others wondered who they could be. But the Buddha said, "They are my good friends," and they thought this must be true. Later, when the Buddha preached the Daijuku Sutra at the Great Treasure Chamber and the Daibon Hanya Sutra at the White Heron Lake, great bodhisattvas appeared in the assembly, and Miraku and the others supposed that they too were friends of the Buddha. But these great bodhisattvas who had newly appeared out of the earth were older and more distinguished looking than those earlier bodhisattvas. One might conclude that they were the teachers of the Buddha, and yet he had, quote, "caused them for the first time to aspire to enlightenment," end quote, and when they were still young, had converted them and made them his disciples. It was this that Miraku and the others found so profoundly perplexing. Prince Shotoku of Japan was the son of Emperor Yomei, the 32nd sovereign of Japan. When he was 6 years old, elderly men came to Japan from the states of Pakche and Koguryo in Korea and from the land of China. The 6-year-old prince thereupon exclaimed, "These are my disciples." And the old men in turn pressed their palms together in reverence and said, "You are our teacher." This was a strange happening indeed. There is a similar story found in a secular work. According to this work, a man was walking along a road when he saw by the roadside a young man of about 30 who was beating an old man of about 80. When he asked the reason, the young man replied, "This old man is my son." Bodhisattva Miraku, continuing to doubt, said, quote, "World-honored one, when you were crowned prince, you left the palace of the Shakyas and sat in the place of meditation not far from the city of Gaya, where you attained the supreme enlightenment. A mere 40 years or so have passed since then. In that short period of time, how could you have accomplished so much great work as a Buddha?" End quote. The various bodhisattvas who had attended the numerous assemblies held in the 40-some years since the Buddha preached the Kegon Sutra had raised doubts at each assembly. The Buddha dispelled these doubts for the benefit of the multitude, but this present doubt concerning the bodhisattvas who had appeared out of the earth was the greatest doubt of all. It surpassed even the doubt entertained by Daishonin and the others of the 80,000 great men described in the Muryogi Sutra, when the Buddha, after declaring in the previous 40-some years of his teachings that enlightenment was something that required countless eons to attain, now announced that it could be attained in a very short time. According to the Kaimuryoju Sutra, King Ajatashatru, led astray by Devadatta, imprisoned his father and was on the point of killing his mother, Lady Vaidehi. Reprimanded by the physician Jivaka and the court minister Chandraprabha, however, he spared his mother's life. At that time, she had an interview with the Buddha and began by posing this question, quote, "What sin have I committed in the past that I should have given birth to this evil son? And, world-honored one, through what cause have you come to be related to a person as evil as your cousin Devadatta?" End quote. Of the two doubts raised here, the second is the more perplexing. The question of why the Buddha should be related to an evil person like Devadatta. A wheel-turning king, we are told, is never born into the world along with his enemies, nor is the god Taishaku to be found in the company of demons. The Buddha had been a merciful personage for countless eons, yet the fact that Shakyamuni was related to Devadatta might make one doubt whether he was indeed a Buddha at all. The Buddha, however, did not answer the question of Lady Vaidehi. Therefore, if one reads only the Kaimuryoju Sutra and does not examine the Devadatta chapter of the Lotus Sutra, he will never know the truth of the matter. In the Nirvana Sutra, Bodhisattva Kasho posed 36 questions to the Buddha, but even these cannot compare to this question concerning the Bodhisattvas who appeared from the earth. If the Buddha had failed to dispel the doubts concerning this matter, the sacred teachings of his entire lifetime would have amounted to no more than froth on the water, and the members of the multitude would have remained tangled in the snare of doubt. That was why it was so important for him to preach the Juryo chapter. Later, when the Buddha preached the Juryo chapter, he said, quote, "All the human and heavenly beings and the ashuras at present believe that Shakyamuni Buddha, after leaving the palace of the Shakyas, sat in the place of meditation not far from the city of Gaya, and there attained the supreme enlightenment." End quote. This passage expresses the view held by all the great bodhisattvas from the time when Shakyamuni first attained enlightenment until the preaching of the Anrakugyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra. However, men of devout faith, the Buddha continued, the time is limitless and boundless. 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 Nayuta eons since I in fact attained Buddhahood. 3 places in the Kegon Sutra, the Buddha said, I have attained enlightenment for the first time in India. In the Agaran Sutras, he speaks of having for the first time attained enlightenment. In the Vimalakirti Sutra, he says, for the first time the Buddha sat beneath the tree. In the Daijuku Sutra, it is 16 years since the Buddha first attained enlightenment. In the Dainichi Sutra, some years ago when I sat in the place of meditation. In the Nino Sutra, 29 years since my enlightenment. In the Muryogi Sutra, previously I went to the place of meditation. In the Hoben chapter of the Lotus Sutra, when I first sat in the place of meditation. But now all these passages have been exposed as gross falsehoods by the single pronouncement in the Juryo chapter. When Shakyamuni Buddha revealed that he had gained enlightenment in the far distant past and had since been constantly in the world, it became apparent that all the other Buddhas were emanations of Shakyamuni. When the Buddha preached the earlier sutras in the theoretical chapters of the Lotus Sutra, the other Buddhas present were pictured as practicing various religious austerities and disciplines side by side with Shakyamuni Buddha. Therefore, the people who pay devotion to one or another of these Buddhas as the object of worship customarily look down on Shakyamuni Buddha. But now it becomes apparent that Vairocana Buddha of the Kegon Sutra and the various Buddhas of the Hodo, Hanya, and Dainichi Sutras are all in fact followers of Shakyamuni Buddha. When Shakyamuni gained enlightenment at the age of 30, he seized the Sahar world away from Bonten and the devil of the sixth heaven, who had ruled it previously, and made it his own. In the earlier sutras and the theoretical chapters of the Lotus Sutra, he called the regions of the 10 directions pure lands, and spoke of the present world as an impure land. But now he has reversed this in the Juryo chapter, revealing that this world is the true pure land, and the so-called pure lands of the 10 directions are impure lands, mere provisional lands. Since the Buddha of the Juryo chapter is revealed as the eternal Buddha, it follows that the great bodhisattvas such as Monju and Miroku, and the great bodhisattvas from other realms are in fact disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha. If, among all the numerous sutras, this Juryo chapter should be lacking, it would be as though there were no sun and moon in the sky, no supreme ruler in the nation, no gems in the mountains and rivers, and no spirit in man. Nevertheless, Chang'an Quan, Chiaxiang, Tzu En, Kobo, and others, learned men from provisional sects such as Kegon and Shingon, in order to praise the various sutras upon which their provisional doctrines are based, go so far as to say, quote, the Buddha of the Kegon Sutra is the Buddha of his property of wisdom aspect, while the Buddha of the Lotus Sutra is merely the Buddha of his property of action aspect, end quote. Or they say, quote, the Buddha of the Juryo chapter of the Lotus Sutra is in the region of darkness, while the Buddha of the Dainichi Sutra occupies the position of enlightenment, end quote. As clouds obscure the moon, so calumnious ministers can obscure the man of true worth. A yellow stone, if people praise it, may be mistaken for a jewel. and ministers who are skilled in flattery may be mistaken for worthy men. In this impure age we live in, scholars and students are confused by the slanderous assertions of the kind of men I have mentioned above, and they do not appreciate the true worth of the jewel of the Juryo chapter. Even among the men of the Tendai sect, there are those who have become so deluded that they cannot distinguish the gold of the Lotus Sutra from the mere stones that are the earlier sutras. One should consider the fact that, if the Buddha had not attained enlightenment in the distant past, there could not have been so many people who were converted to his teachings. The moon is not stingy with its shining, but if there is no water to catch its rays, then its reflections will not be seen. The Buddha may be very anxious to convert all people, but if he cannot establish some connection with them, then he cannot go through the 8 phases of a Buddha's existence. Thus, for example, the Shomon disciples attained the first stage of security and the first stage of development. But because they followed the teachings that preceded the Lotus Sutra and sought only to regulate and save themselves, they had to postpone the attainment of the 8 phases of a Buddha's existence to some future lifetime. If Shakyamuni Buddha had actually attained enlightenment for the first time at the age of 30, then when he preached the Lotus Sutra, Bonten, Taishaku, the gods of the sun and moon, and the 4 heavenly kings who have ruled the present world from countless ages in the past would have been disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha for no longer than a period of 40-some years. During the 8 years when he preached the Lotus Sutra, the beings who assembled to listen to him would have been unable to accept as their master a person who had so recently come to prominence, and would have deferred instead to Bonten, Taishaku, and the other deities who had from ages past been the lords of this world. But now that it becomes apparent that Shakyamuni Buddha attained enlightenment countless eons ago, then the Bodhisattvas Nikko and Gakko, who attend the Buddha Yakushi of the eastern region, the Bodhisattvas Kannon and Seishi, who attend the Buddha Amida of the western region, along with the disciples of all the Buddhas of the worlds of the 10 directions and the great Bodhisattvas who are disciples of the Buddha Dainichi as they are shown in the Dainichi and Kongocho Sutras, all of these beings are disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha. Since the various Buddhas themselves are emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha, it goes without saying that their disciples must be disciples of Shakyamuni. And of course the various deities of the sun, moon, and stars, who have dwelt in this world from countless ages in the past, must likewise be disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha. Nevertheless, the sects of Buddhism other than Tendai have gone astray concerning the true object of worship. The Kusha, Jojitsu, and Ritsu sects take as their object of worship the Shakyamuni Buddha who eliminated illusions by practicing 34 kinds of spiritual purification. This is comparable to a situation in which the heir apparent of a supreme ruler of a state mistakenly believes himself to be the son of a commoner. The 4 sects of Kegon, Shingon, Sanran, and Hosso are all Mahayana schools of Buddhism. Among them, the Hosso and Shanran sect worship a Buddha who is comparable to the Buddha in the superior property of action aspect. This is like the era of the supreme ruler, supposing that his father was a member of the samurai class. The Kegon and Shingon sects look down upon Shakyamuni Buddha and declare that Mahavajrayana or Dainichi Buddha should be the true object of worship. This is like the heir looking down upon his own father, the supreme ruler, and paying honor to one who is not even related to him by blood simply because that person pretends to be the Dharma king. The Jodo sect considers itself to be most closely related to the Buddha Amida, who is an emanation of Shakyamuni, and rejects Shakyamuni himself. The Zen sect behaves like a person of low birth who makes much of his own achievements and despises his father and mother. Thus, the Zen sect rejects both the Buddha and the sutras. All of these sects are misled concerning the true object of worship. They are like the people who lived in the age before the 3 rulers of ancient China and did not know who their own fathers were. In that respect, the people of that time were no different from birds and beasts. The men of these sects who are ignorant of the teachings of the Juryo chapter are similarly like beasts. They do not understand to whom they are obligated. Therefore, Miao Lo states, quote, "Among all the teachings of the Buddha's lifetime, there is no place other than the Juryo chapter where the true longevity of the Buddha is revealed. A person ought to know how old his father and mother are. If a son does not even know how old his father is, he will also be in doubt as to what land his father presides over. Though he may be idly praised for his talents and ability, he cannot be counted as a son at all." End quote. The great teacher Miao Lo lived in the Tianpao era, from 742 to 755, and the latter part of the Tang dynasty. He is saying that if one makes a deep and thorough examination of the Sanran, Kegon, Hosso, and Shingon sects, and the sutras upon which they are based, but fails to become acquainted with the Buddha of the Juryo chapter, he is no more than a talented animal who does not even know what land his father presides over. Though he may be idly praised for his talent and ability, refers to men like Fa Stang and Chang Quan of the Kegon sect, or Shan Wu Wei of the Shingon sect. These teachers had a talent and ability, yet they were like sons who do not even know their own father. The great teacher Denyo was the patriarch of both esoteric and exoteric Buddhism in Japan. In his Hokkei Shuku, he writes, quote, "The sutras that the other sects are based upon give expression to the mother-like nature of the Buddha, but they convey only a sense of love and are lacking in a sense of fatherly sternness. It is only the Tendai sect, based upon the Lotus Sutra, that combines a sense of both love and sternness. The sutra is a father to all the worthy men, sages, those in the stages of learning and beyond learning, and those who have awakened in themselves the mind of the Bodhisattva." End quote. The sutras that form the basis of the Shingon and Keigon sects do not even contain the terms sowing, maturing, and harvest, much less the doctrine of sowing of the seeds of Buddhahood, maturing the seeds, and the eventual attainment of Buddhahood, to which these terms refer. When the sutras of the Keigon and Shingon sects assert that their followers will enter the first stage of development and achieve Buddhahood in the same lifetime, they are putting forth the teachings of the provisional sutras alone, teachings that conceal the role of the past. To expect to attain fruition without having the seed first sowed is like the eunuch Cao Cao, attempting to seize imperial power in China, or the monk Dokyo, trying to become emperor of Japan. The various sects argue with one another, each claiming that its sutra contains the true seeds of enlightenment. I do not intend to enter the argument. I will let the sutras speak for themselves. Thus, the Bodhisattva Vasubandhu, speaking of the seeds of enlightenment implanted by the Lotus Sutra, designates them the seeds without peer. And these seeds of enlightenment are the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen as expounded by the great teacher Tiantai. The seed of enlightenment of the various Buddhas described in the Keigon Sutra, the other various Mahayana Sutras, and the Dainichi Sutra is the one doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen. And the great teacher Tiantai was the only person who was capable of perceiving the truth of this doctrine. Chen Quan of the Keigon sect usurped the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen and used it to interpret the passage in the Keigon Sutra that reads, quote, "The mind is like a skilled painter," end quote. The Dainichi Sutra of the Shingon sect contains no mention of the fact that the Shoman and Engaku can attain Buddhahood, that the Buddha Shakyamuni achieved enlightenment countless eons ago, or of the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen. But after Shan Wei came to China, he had the occasion to read the Makashikan by Tiantai, and came to gain wisdom and understanding. He then usurped the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen, using it to interpret the passages in the Dainichi Sutra on the reality of the mind, or that which reads, quote, "I am the source and beginning of all things," end quote, making it the core of Shingon teaching, but adding to it the practice of mudras and mantras. And in comparing the relative merits of the Lotus Sutra and the Dainichi Sutra, he declared that while the two agree in principle, the latter is superior in practice. The mandalas of the two worlds symbolize the attaining of Buddhahood by the Shoman and Engaku in the mutual possession of the 10 worlds, but are these doctrines to be found anywhere in the Dainichi Sutra? Those who claim so are guilty of the grossest deception. Therefore, the great teacher Denyo writes, quote, "The school of Shingon Buddhism that has recently been brought to Japan deliberately distorts its teachings to suit its purposes, while the Keigon school that was introduced earlier attempts to disguise the fact that it was influenced by the doctrines of Tiantai," end quote. Suppose someone were to go to some wild region like the island of Ezo in Hokkaido and recite the famous poem, "How I Think of It, dim, dim in the morning mist of Akashi Bay, that boat moving out of sight beyond the islands." If the person told the ignorant natives of Ezo that he himself had composed this poem, they would probably believe him. The Buddhist scholars of China and Japan are equally gullible. The Chinese priest Liang Shu of the Tiantai sect writes, quote, "The doctrines of the Shingon, Zen, Keigon, Sanran can at best serve as a kind of introduction to the Lotus Sutra," end quote. We are told that Shan Wu-wei was subjected to punishment by Emma, the king of hell, no doubt because of his mistaken view that the Dainichi Sutra is superior to the Lotus Sutra. Later, he had a change of heart and became an enthusiastic supporter of the Lotus Sutra, which is why he was spared further punishment. As evidence, when he, Pukang, and the others devised mandalas to symbolize the teachings of the Shingon sect, they placed the Lotus Sutra at the center of the two worlds as the supreme ruler, with the Womb World Mandala of the Dainichi Sutra and the Diamond World Mandala of the Kongocho Sutra to the left and right as ministers to the ruler. When Kobo of Japan drew up a theoretical statement of the Shingon teachings, he was influenced by the Keigon sect and assigned the Keigon Sutra to the 9th stage of advancement, and the Lotus Sutra to the 8th stage. But when he taught the practices and ceremonies to his disciples Jite, Shinga, Incho, Kojo, and others, he placed the Lotus Sutra in the central position, above the two worlds of the Womb and Diamond, as Shan Wu and Pukang did. In a similar case, Chia Tsang of the Sanran sect, in his 10-volume Hokke Genron, assigned the Lotus Sutra to the 4th of the 5 periods of teachings, claiming that it opened the way of the Bodhisattva to the Shoman and Engaku. Later, however, he became converted to the teachings of Tiantai. He ceased giving lectures, dismissed his disciples, and instead served the great teacher Tiantai for a period of 7 years, personally carrying Tiantai on his back when Tiantai mounted an elevated seat for preaching. Again, Zhu En, the founder of the Hosso sect, in his 7-volume and 12-volume Daijo Hoon Girinjo, states, quote, "The one-vehicle doctrine set forth in the Lotus Sutra is a mere expedient. The 3-vehicle doctrine represents the truth," end quote. He also makes many similarly absurd pronouncements, but in the 4th volume of the Hokke Genzan Yoshu, he is represented as saying that, quote, "both doctrines are to be accepted," end quote, thus bringing flexible interpretation to the tenets of his own sect. Although he said that both doctrines are acceptable, in his heart he supported the Tiantai teachings of the Lotus Sutra. Chen Quan of the Keigon sect wrote a commentary on the Keigon Sutra in which he compared the Keigon and Lotus Sutras and declared that the Lotus Sutra appears to be a mere expedient doctrine. But elsewhere he wrote, quote, I believe that the teachings of the Tiantai sect represent the truth. In doctrine and principle, they completely agree with those of my own sect. End quote. From this it would appear, would it not, that he regretted his earlier pronouncement. Kobo is a similar example. If one has no mirror, he cannot see his own face. If one has no opponents, he cannot learn his own errors. The scholars of the Shingon and the other various sects were unaware of their errors, but after they were fortunate enough to encounter the great teacher Dengyo, they became conscious of the mistakes of their own particular sects. The various Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and heavenly and human beings described in the sutras that precede the Lotus Sutra may seem to have gained enlightenment through the particular sutras in which they appear, but in fact they attained enlightenment only through the Lotus Sutra. The first of the general vows taken by Shakyamuni and the other Buddhas to save the countless sentient beings finds fulfillment through the Lotus Sutra. That is the meaning of the passage in the Holben chapter of the Lotus Sutra in which Shakyamuni declares, quote, by now the original vows that I made have already been fulfilled, end quote. In view of these facts, I believe that the devotees and followers of the various provisional sutras such as the Kegon, Kamaryoju, and Dainichi sutras will undoubtedly be protected by the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and heavenly beings of the respective sutras that they uphold. But if the votaries of the Dainichi, Kamaryoju, and other sutras should set themselves up as the enemies of the votary of the Lotus Sutra, then the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and heavenly beings will abandon them and will protect the votary of the Lotus Sutra. It is like the case of a filial son whose father opposes the ruler of a kingdom. The son will abandon his father and support the ruler, for to do so is the height of filial piety. The same thing applies to Buddhism. The Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and the 10 goddesses described in the Lotus Sutra lend their protection to Nichiren, the votary of the lotus. And in addition, the Buddhas of the 6 directions and the 25 Bodhisattvas of the Jodo sect, the 1,200 venerable ones of the Shingon sect, and the various venerable ones and benevolent guardian deities of the 7 sects also protect Nichiren. It is like the case of the great teacher Dengyo, who was protected by the guardian deities of the 7 sects. I, Nichiren, have this to say. The gods of the sun and moon and the other deities were present in the 2 places and 3 assemblies when the Lotus Sutra was preached. If a votary of the Lotus Sutra should appear, then, like iron drawn to a magnet or the reflection of the moon appearing in the water, they will instantly come forth and take on his sufferings for him, and thereby fulfill the vow that they had made in the presence of the Buddha. But they have yet to come and inquire of my well-being. Does this mean that I am not a true votary of the Lotus Sutra? If that is so, then I must examine the text of the sutra once more in the light of my conduct and see where I am at fault. Question. What eyes of wisdom allow you to perceive that the Nembutsu, Zen, and other sects of our time are the enemies of the Lotus Sutra and evil companions who are ready to mislead all people? Answer. I do not state arbitrary opinions, but merely hold up the mirror of the sutras and commentaries so that the slanderers of the law may see their ugly faces reflected there and perceive their errors. But blind men that they are, they seem incapable of doing so. In the Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra, we read, quote, at that time Taho Buddha in the treasure tower gave half of his seat to Shakyamuni Buddha. At that time the great multitude saw the 2 Buddhas seated with legs crossed on the lion throne in the Tower of 7 Treasures. Shakyamuni Buddha addressed the 4 kinds of believers in a loud voice, saying, who among you will propagate the Lotus Sutra throughout the Saha world? Now is the time to do so. Before long I will enter Nirvana. The Buddha hopes there is someone to whom he can entrust this Lotus Sutra. End quote. This is the first pronouncement of the Buddha. Again, the chapter reads, quote, at this time the world-honored one, wishing to repeat the announcement that he had just made, spoke in verse. The sainted Lord, world-honored one, Taho Buddha, though he passed into nirvana long ago, seats himself in the treasure tower, coming here for the sake of the law. You people, why then do you not strive for the sake of the law? My emanations, these numberless Buddhas, who are like sands of the Ganges, they have come desiring to hear the law. Each has abandoned his precious land, as well as his host of disciples, the heavenly and human beings, dragons and gods, and all the offerings they give him, to make certain that the law will long endure. They have come to this place. It is like the branches of small trees when a great wind blows them. Through this expedient means, they will make certain that the law will long endure. So I say to the great assembly, after I have passed away, who can protect and maintain, read and recite the sutra? Now, in the presence of the Buddha, let him come forward and speak his vow. End quote. This is the second proclamation of the Buddha. The passage continues, quote, Taho Buddha, myself, and the emanations of myself who are gathered here, they know the intention of my words. Men of devout faith, each of you must consider carefully. This is a difficult matter. It is proper that you take a great vow. The other sutras number as many as the sands of the Ganges, but though you expound them all, that is not worthy to be considered difficult. To seize Mount Sumeru and fling it far off to the measureless Buddha lands, that too is not difficult. But after the Buddha's passing, in the time of evil, to be able to preach this sutra, that is difficult indeed. When the fire comes at the end of the kalpa, to load dry grass on one's back and enter the fire without being burned, that is not difficult. But after my passing, to be able to preserve this sutra and expound it to even one person, That is difficult indeed. Men of devout faith, after my passing, who can receive and embrace, read and recite this sutra? Now, in the presence of the Buddha, let him come forward and speak his vow." End quote. This is the third admonition from the Buddha. The fourth and fifth admonitions are found in the Devadatta chapter, and I will deal with them later. The meaning of these passages from the sutra is right before our eyes, obvious as the sun suspended in the blue sky or a mole on a white face. And yet the blind ones, those with perverse eyes, the one-eyed, those who believe no one but their own teachers, and those who cling to biased views cannot see it. For those who are determined to surmount all difficulties and have set their hearts on the truth, I will try to explain and point out the way. But they must understand that the truth is more rarely met with than the peaches of immortality that grow in the garden of the Queen Mother of the West, or the Udumbara flower that blooms only once every 3,000 years in the age of a wheel-turning monarch. Moreover, the conflict among the sects over their superiority surpasses 8 years of warfare when Liu Pang and Xiang Yu battled for the Empire of China. The 7 years when Minamoto no Yoritomo and Taira no Munemori fought for the islands of Japan, the struggles between Taishaku and the Ashiras, or between the Dragon Kings and the Garuda birds at the Icy Lake. This truth that I am speaking of has made its appearance twice in the country of Japan. You should understand that it appeared once with the great teacher Dengyo, and again with Nichiren. But the sightless ones doubt this, and they do not have the strength to believe. Shakyamuni Buddha, Taho Buddha, and the Buddhas of the 10 directions gathered together and judged the relative merits of all the sutras of Japan, China, India, the Palace of the Dragon King, the heavens, and all the other worlds of the 10 directions, and this is the sutra they chose. Question: do sutras such as the Keigon, Hodo, Hanya, Himitsu, Ryoga, Dainichi, and Nirvana sutras belong to the 9 easy acts group or the 6 difficult acts group? Answer: Tu Shun, Qi Yen, Fa Tang, and Chen Quan of the Keigon sect, who were all masters of the 3 divisions of the Tripitaka, stated that both the Lotus Sutra and the Keigon Sutras belong to the 6 difficult acts category. Though in name they are 2 different sutras, they are identical in their teachings and principles. It is similar to the statement, though the 4 views of reality are separate, the truth they point to is identical. Chuanzang and Tzu-En of the Hoso sect state that the Jinmitsu Sutra and the Lotus Sutra both expound the consciousness-only doctrine. They date from the 3rd period of the Buddha's teaching and belong to the 6 difficult category. Qiazhang of the Sanran sect asserts that the Hanya Sutra and the Lotus Sutra are different names for a single entity, 2 sutras that preach one truth. Shanwu Wei, Qingkangqi, and Pukong of the Shingon sect say that the Dainichi Sutra and the Lotus Sutra are identical in principle and that both belong to the 6 difficult category. But the Japanese Shingon leader Kobo says that the Dainichi Sutra belongs neither to the 6 difficult nor the 9 easy category. The Dainichi Sutra, according to him, stands apart from all the other sutras preached by Shakyamuni Buddha, since it was preached by Dainichi Buddha, the Buddha in the property of law aspect. Likewise, some persons assert that since the Keigon Sutra was preached by the Buddha in his property of wisdom aspect, it stands outside the categories of 6 difficult and 9 easy. Such, then, are the views put forth by the founders of these 4 sects. The thousands of followers of these sects likewise subscribe to the same views. I must observe sadly, although it would be simple enough to point out the error of the views put forward by these men, if I did so, the people of today would not even look in my direction, much less listen to me. They would go on in their erroneous ways, and in the end would slander me to the rulers of the country and put my life in jeopardy. Nevertheless, our merciful father Shakyamuni Buddha, when he faced his end in the grove of sal trees, stated as his dying instruction that we are to, quote, rely on the law and not upon the persons, end quote. Not relying upon persons means that when persons of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ranks preach, even though they are bodhisattvas such as Fugen or Monju, whose enlightenment almost approaches that of the Buddha, if they do not preach with the sutra in hand, following its teachings faithfully, then they are not to be accepted. It is also laid down that one should rely on the sutras that are complete and final and not on those which are not complete and final. We must therefore look carefully among the sutras to determine which are complete and final and which are not, and put our faith in the former. Bodhisattva Nagarjuna in his Juju Bibasharon states, quote, do not rely on treatises that distort the sutras. Rely only on those that are faithful to the sutras, end quote. The great teacher Tiantai says, quote, that which accords with the sutras is to be accepted and heeded, but put no faith in anything that in word or meaning fails to do so, end quote. The great teacher Dengyo says, quote, depend upon the teachings of the Buddha and do not put faith in traditions handed down orally, end quote. Enchin, or Chisho Daishi, says, quote, in transmitting the teachings rely on the written words, end quote. To be sure, the leaders of the various sects whose opinions I have quoted above all base themselves on some group of sutras and treatises in attempting to establish which teachings are the most superior. But these men all cling firmly to the doctrines of their own sect and perpetuate the erroneous views handed down from their predecessors. so that their judgments are characterized by twisted interpretations and personal feelings. Their doctrines are no more than private opinions that have been dressed up and glorified. The non-Buddhist sects of men such as Vatiputriya and Vaipulya, which appeared in India after the Buddha's death, are even more wrong in their views and more cunning in their doctrines than their counterparts before the Buddha, because they borrowed ideas from Buddhism. Similarly, since the introduction of Buddhism to China in the later Han Dynasty, non-Buddhist views and writings have become even more wrong and cunning than the pre-Buddhist writings of Confucianism that deal with the 3 rulers and 5 emperors of antiquity. Also, the leaders of the Kegon, Hoso, Shingon, and other sects, jealous of the orthodox teachings of the Tiantai sect, brazenly interpret the words of the True Sutra, i.e. the Lotus Sutra, in such a way that they will accord with the provisional teachings. Those who seek the truth of Buddhism, however, should reject such one-sided views, whether they are of their own sects or of other sects, and should not treat others with contempt. In the Hoshi chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha says, quote, "Among all the sutras I have preached, now preach, and will preach, this Lotus Sutra is the most difficult to believe and the most difficult to understand," end quote. Miao Lo remarks, quote, "Though other sutras may call themselves the king among sutras, there is none that announces itself as foremost among all the sutras preached in the past, now being preached, or to be preached in the future," end quote. He also says, quote, "Faced with this wonderful sutra that surpasses all those of past, present, and future, there are those who persist in going astray. They commit the grave fault of slandering the truth, and for many long eons are condemned to hell," end quote. Startled by these passages in the sutras and its commentaries, I examined all the sutras and the expositions and commentaries of the various teachers and found that my doubts and suspicions melted away. But now those foolish Shingon priests rely upon their mudras and mantras and believe that the Shingon sect is superior to the Lotus Sutra, simply because Jigaku Daishi and their other teachers have assured them that Shingon is superior. Their views are not worthy of discussion. The Mitsugan Sutra says, quote, "The Juji, Keigon, Daiju, Jinzu, Srimala, and the other sutras all derive from this sutra. Thus the Mitsugan Sutra is the greatest of all the sutras," end quote. The Daiyun Sutra states, quote, "This sutra is the wheel-turning monarch among all sutras. Why is this? Because in this sutra is set forth the doctrine of the constancy of the Buddha nature as the true nature of all things," end quote. The Rokuharamitsu Sutra says, quote, "All the correct teachings expounded by the countless Buddhas of the past and the 84,000 wonderful laws that I have expounded are in this sutra and may as a whole be divided into 5 categories: 1. Sutra, 2. Vinaya, 3. Abhidharma, 4. Prajnaparamita, 5. Dharani. The works in these 5 collections will instruct and enlighten sentient beings. Among sentient beings there may be those who cannot accept and abide by the sutras, Vinaya, Abhidharma, and Prajnaparamita, or there may be sentient beings who commit various evil acts such as the 4 grave offenses, the 8 grave offenses, or the 5 cardinal sins that lead to the hell of incessant suffering, or slander the Mahayana Sutras and disbelieve Buddhism itself. In order to wipe out such crimes, give rapid release to the offenders, and allow them to enter into nirvana at once, I preached for their sake this collection of Dharanis." These 5 divisions of the Dharma are compared to the flavors of milk, cream, curdled milk, butter, and ghee, respectively, with ghee as the finest. The division containing the Dharanis compares to ghee. Ghee has the finest and most subtle flavor among the 5 substances enumerated above, and is capable of curing various sicknesses and easing the minds and bodies of sentient beings. Similarly, the Dharani division stands foremost among the 5 divisions of the teachings because it can do away with grave offenses." End quote. The Gejimitsu Sutra states, quote, "At the time the Bodhisattva Shogisho addressed the Buddha saying, 'World-honored one, in the first period of your teachings when you were in Deer Park in Varanasi, for the sake of those who wished merely to embark upon the way of the Shoman, you expounded the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths, in this way turning the wheel of the correct law. This was a very wonderful thing, a very rare thing. No heavenly or human being in any of the countless worlds had ever been able to expound such a doctrine as this before. And yet the wheel of the law that you turned at that time left room for improvement, left room for doubt. It was not yet final in meaning and offered ample opportunity for dispute. Then, world-honored one, in the second period of your teaching, for the sake of those who wished merely to practice the way of the great vehicle, you taught that all phenomena are without distinct natures of their own, that there is no birth and death, that all beings are basically in a state of quietude, and that the nature of beings as they exist constitutes nirvana. You turned the wheel of the correct law, although you did not reveal the whole truth. This was even more wonderful, and even rarer thing. But the wheel of the law that you turned at that time left room for improvement, left room for doubt. It was not yet final in meaning and offered ample opportunity for dispute. Now, world-honored one, in the third period of your teaching, for the sake of those who wish to practice the vehicle that saves all beings, you taught that all phenomena are without distinctive nature, and that there is no birth or death, and that all things are basically in a state of quietude, and that the nature of beings as they exist constitutes nirvana. Then you have taught that the nature you spoke of itself lacks anything that can be called a nature. You have turned the wheel of the correct law and expounded these doctrines in their perfect form. This is most wonderful, the rarest thing of all. This wheel of the law that you have turned leaves no doubt for improvement, no room for doubt. It is truly complete and final in meaning and offers no opportunity for dispute." End quote. The Daihanya Sutra says, quote, "By listening to the laws of the secular world in Buddhism, all beings may through expedient means be brought to understand and embrace the profound principles of prajna or wisdom. And they will also continue to understand and embrace the truth that through prajna, all actions carried out in the present world can be seen to partake of the Dharma nature, and that there is nothing whatsoever that is outside the Dharma nature." End quote. The first volume of the Dainichi Sutra states, quote, "Master of secrets, there is a great vehicle practice which arouses the mind that is unrelated to things and leads one to understand that all phenomena are without individual natures. Why is this? Because in past times those who practiced this way were able to observe the alaya consciousness, and that which is stored in it, and to realize that individual natures are illusory." End quote. The same sutra also says, quote, "Master of secrets, these men in this way cast aside the concept of egolessness and came to realize that the mind exists in a realm of freedom, and that the individual mind has from the beginning never known birth or death." End quote. It also says, quote, "Ku, or emptiness, is by nature removed from the sense organs and their objects. It has no form nor boundaries, but is a kind of void that transcends all theory. It represents the ultimate in the absence of individual nature." End quote. It also says, quote, "The Buddha Dainichi or Mahavaratana addressed the Master of Secrets saying, 'Master of Secrets, what is the meaning of enlightenment? It means to understand one's own mind as it truly is.'" End quote. The Keigon Sutra states, quote, "Among the various beings of all the different worlds, there are few who seek to practice the vehicle of the Shomon. There are still fewer who seek that of the Engaku, and those who seek the great vehicle are extremely rare. To seek the great vehicle is relatively easy to do, but to have faith in the doctrines of the sutra is difficult in the extreme. And how much more difficult is it to accept the sutra, keep its teachings correctly in mind, practice them as directed, and understand their true meaning. To take the major world system and hold it on the top of your head without moving for the space of a kalpa is not such a difficult thing to do. But to have faith in the doctrines of this sutra is difficult in the extreme. For the space of a kalpa, to offer musical instruments to all the sentient beings who are as countless as the dust particles of the major world system will not gain you much merit. But to have faith in the doctrine of this sutra will gain you merit in great quantity. To hold 10 Buddha lands in the palm of your hand and remain stationary in the midst of the air for the space of a kalpa is not so difficult to do. But to have faith in the doctrines of this sutra is difficult in the extreme. For the space of a kalpa, to offer musical instruments to all sentient beings who are as countless as the dust particles of those 10 Buddha lands will not gain you much merit. But to have faith in the doctrines of this sutra will gain you merit in great quantity. For the space of a kalpa, you may honor and give alms to the various Buddhas who are as countless as the dust particles of those Buddha lands. But if you can accept and abide by the doctrines of this chapter, you will gain vastly greater merit." End quote. The Nirvana Sutra says, quote, "Although belief in the various Mahayana sutras will bring inestimable merit, there is no way to describe how much greater is the merit gained by belief in this sutra. It is 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times greater in a way that is beyond calculation or simile. Men of devout faith, milk comes from the cow. Cream is made from milk. Curdled milk is made from the cream. Butter is made from curdled milk, and ghee is made from butter. Ghee is the finest of all. He who eats it will be cured of all illnesses, for all kinds of medicinal properties are contained in it. Men of devout faith, the Buddha is like this. The Buddha brought forth the 12 divisions of the sacred writings. From among these 12 divisions he brought forth the sutras. From among the sutras he brought forth the Mahayana sutras. From the Mahayana sutras he brought forth the Hanya Haramitsu sutras. And from the Hanya Haramitsu sutras he brought forth the Nirvana Sutra. The Nirvana Sutra is comparable to ghee. Ghee here is a metaphor that stands for the Buddha nature, inherent within all beings." End quote. When we compare these sutras that I have just quoted with the Lotus Sutra, the greatest of past, present, and future, with its 6 difficult and 9 easy acts, it stands out like the bright moon beside the tiny stars, or Mount Sumeru, highest of all mountains, beside the other 8 mountains which surround it. And yet Cheng Quan of the Keigon sect, Tsu En of the Hoso sect, Cha Tang of the Sanran sect, and Kobo of the Shingon sect, all men who were believed to possess the Buddha eye of wisdom, did not understand the above phrases of the Lotus Sutra. How then could the ordinary scholars of the time, who appeared to be quite blind, be expected to judge the difference between the Lotus Sutra and the other ones? This difference is as plain as black and white, or Mount Sumeru side by side with a mustard seed, yet these men go astray. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that they are also confused by the doctrines as vast as the sky derived from all the sutras. Unless one can perceive the relative profundity of the various writings, he cannot judge the worth of the doctrines that derive from them. The teachings of the sutra often differ from volume to volume and must be understood in their proper order. Since it is difficult to judge the worth of these teachings, I will quote further passages and try to help the ignorant to understand. When it comes to kings, there are great kings and minor kings, and in any matter whatsoever there are parts and there is the whole. We have talked about the simile of the 5 flavors of milk, cream, curdled milk, butter, and ghee, but we must understand when this simile is being applied to Buddhist teachings as a whole, and when it is being applied to one part of those teachings. The Rokuharamitsu Sutra teaches that sentient beings can attain enlightenment, but it says nothing about the enlightenment of insentient beings. And of course it mentions nothing about the doctrine that Shakyamuni Buddha attained enlightenment countless ages in the past. The Rokuharamitsu Sutra claims that the Dharanis are comparable to ghee, but they cannot in fact be compared with the Nirvana Sutra, which compares itself with ghee, much less with the theoretical and essential teachings of the Lotus Sutra. And yet Kobo Daishi of Japan, misled by this sutra, assigned the Lotus Sutra to the 4th category, comparing it to the flavor of butter. If the so-called ghee of the Dharanis cannot even match the so-called ghee of the Nirvana Sutra, then how could he possibly make such an obvious mistake? And yet he writes that the teachers of China in their competition have stolen the ghee, calling Tiantai and the others thieves, and in a boastful vein he writes, quote, "What a pity it is that the worthy men of ancient times were not able to taste this ghee." End quote. I will point out the truth for the sake of my followers. If others do not choose to believe it now, they will eventually come to take faith after suffering from the bad karma they will create for themselves. By tasting a single drop, one can tell the flavor of the great ocean, and by observing a single flower in bloom, one can predict the advent of spring. One does not have to cross the water to far-off China, spend 3 years traveling to Eagle Peak in India, enter the palace of the Dragon King the way Nagarjuna did, encounter the Bodhisattva Miroku the way Asanga did, or be present at the 2 places and 3 assemblies when Shakyamuni preached the Lotus Sutra, in order to judge the relative merits of the Buddhist teachings. It is said that snakes can tell 7 days in advance when a flood is going to occur. This is because they are akin to dragons, who make the rain fall. Crows can tell what lucky or unlucky events are going to take place throughout the course of a year. This is because in a past existence they were diviners. Birds are better at flying than human beings. And I, Nichiren, am better at judging the relative merits of sutras than Chen Quan of the Keigan sect, Chia Tsang of the Sanran sect, Chu En of the Hoso sect, and Kobo of the Shingon sect. That is because I follow in the footsteps of the teachers Tiantai and Dengyo. But Chen Quan and the others, because they did not heed the teachings of Tiantai and Dengyo, could not avoid committing the error of slandering the truth. I, Nichiren, am the richest man in all of present-day Japan. I have dedicated my life to the Lotus Sutra, and my name will be handed down in ages to come. If one is lord of the great ocean, then all the gods of the various rivers will obey him. If one is king of Mount Sumeru, then the gods of the various other mountains cannot help but serve him. If one can understand the doctrine of the 6 difficult and 9 easy acts of the Lotus Sutra, then, without reading the other sutras, he can command the allegiance of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. In addition to the 3 pronouncements of the Buddha in the Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the Devadatta chapter contains 2 enlightening admonitions. The first reveals that Devadatta will attain Buddhahood. Devadatta was a man of incorrigible disbelief, of the type called Ekchantika, and yet it is predicted that he will in the future become a Buddha called Heavenly King. The 40 volumes of the Nirvana Sutra state that all beings, including the Ekchantika, possess the Buddha nature, but the actual proof of that is found in this chapter of the Lotus Sutra. There are countless other persons, such as the monk Sunakshatra or King Ajatasattu, who have committed the 5 cardinal sins and slandered the truth. But Devadatta is cited as one example to represent all the countless others. He is the chief offender, and it is assumed that all lesser offenders will fare as he does. Thus it is revealed that all those who commit the 5 or the 7 cardinal sins, or who slander the truth, or are inherently opposed to taking faith, will become Buddhas like the Tathagata Heavenly King. In the Lotus Sutra, poison turns into sweet dew, the finest of all flavors. The second admonition concerns the fact that the Dragon King's daughter attained Buddhahood. When she attained Buddhahood, this does not mean simply that one person did so. It reveals the fact that all women will attain Buddhahood. And the various Hinayana sutras that were preached before the Lotus Sutra, it is denied that women could ever attain Buddhahood. In the Mahayana sutras, other than the Lotus Sutra, it would appear that women can attain Buddhahood, but they may do so only after they have changed into some other form. It is not the kind of immediate attainment of Buddhahood that is encompassed in the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen. Thus, it is an attainment of Buddhahood in name, but not in reality. The Dragon King's daughter is, as the phrase has it, one example that stands for all the rest. When the Dragon King's daughter attained Buddhahood, it opened up the possibility of attaining Buddhahood for all women of later ages. Confucianism preaches filial piety and care for one's parents, but it is limited to the present life. It provides no way for one to assist one's parents in their future lives, and the Confucian sages and worthies are therefore sages and worthies in name only and not in reality. Brahmanism, though it recognizes the existence of past, present, and future lives, similarly offers no means to assist one's parents to a better life in the future. Buddhism alone can do so, and thus it is the true way of sages and worthies. But in the Hinayana and Mahayana sutras preached before the Lotus Sutra, and in the sects based on these sutras, to gain salvation even for oneself is impossible. One can hardly hope to do anything for one's parents either. The possibility exists in theory, but not in fact. Only with the preaching of the Lotus Sutra, in which the Dragon King's daughter attained Buddhahood, did it become evident that the attainment of Buddhahood was a possibility for all the mothers of the world. And when it was revealed that even an evil man such as Devadatta could attain Buddhahood, it became evident that Buddhahood was a possibility for all the fathers of the world. The Confucians have their classic of filial piety, but the Lotus Sutra is the classic of filial piety of Buddhism. This ends my discussion of the two admonitions contained in the Devadatta chapter. Awed by the 5 proclamations of the Buddha made in the Hoto and Devadatta chapters, the countless bodhisattvas promised the Buddha that they would propagate the Lotus Sutra, as described in the Kanji chapter. I shall hold up this passage of the sutra like a bright mirror, so that all may see how the present-day leaders of the Zen, Ritsu, and Nembutsu sects and their lay followers are guilty of slandering the law. On the 12th day of the 9th month of last year, between the hours of the rat and ox, that's 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., this person named Nichiren was beheaded. It is his soul that has come to this island of Sado, and in the 2nd month of the following year, snowbound, is writing this to send to his close followers. The description of the evil age in the Kanji chapter seems terrifying, but because I have dedicated myself to the true law, I, Nichiren, have nothing to be terrified about. Those observing me will be awestruck. This treatise is the bright mirror of Shakyamuni, Taho, and all the other Buddhas of the 10 directions in which the contemporary Japan is reflected. At the same time, it may be regarded as a keepsake from me. In the Kanji chapter of the Lotus Sutra, the Bodhisattvas, addressing the Buddha, say, quote, "We beg you not to worry. After the Buddha has passed away, in an age of fear and evil, we will preach far and wide. There will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us, and will attack us with swords and staves, but we will endure all these things. There will be monks in that evil age with perverse views and hearts that are fawning and crooked, who will say that they have attained what they have not attained, being proud and boastful in their heart. Or there will be forest-dwelling monks wearing clothes of patched rags and living in retirement, who will claim that they are practicing the true way, despising and looking down on the rest of mankind. Greedy for profit and nourishment, they will preach the Dharma to white-robed laymen, and will be respected and revered by the world as though they were arhat who possess the 6 supernatural powers. These men with evil in their hearts, constantly thinking of worldly affairs, will borrow the name of forest-dwelling monks and take delight in proclaiming our faults. Constantly they will go about among the populace, seeking in this way to slander us. They will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and great patrons of Buddhism, as well as the other monks, slandering and speaking evil of us, saying, 'These are men of perverted views who preach the doctrine of heretical sects.' In a muddied kalpa, in an evil age, there will be many different things to fear. Demons will take possession of others, and through them curse, revile, and heap shame upon us. The evil monks of that muddied age, failing to understand the Buddha's expedient means, how he preaches the Dharma in accord with what is appropriate, will confront us with foul language and angry frowns. Again and again we will be banished." End quote. Miao Lo, in the 8th volume of his Hokkei Mongu Ki, comments as follows, quote, "In this passage, 3 types of arrogance are cited. First, there is a section that exposes persons of mistaken views. This represents the arrogance and presumption of the ordinary populace. Next, there is a section that exposes the arrogance and presumption of certain members of the Buddhist clergy. Third is a section that exposes the arrogance and presumption of those who pretend to be sages. Of these 3 types of arrogance, the first can be endured. The second is more formidable than the first, and the third is the most formidable of all. This is because the second is harder to recognize for what it really is, and the third is even harder to recognize." End quote. Priest Chi-Tu writes in the Toshun, quote, "First, in the section dealing with the ignorant people, there is a verse telling how the votaries of the Lotus Sutra must endure evils inflicted by the body, mouth, and mind of their opponents. This refers to evil men among the ordinary populace. Next, in the section on the monks in that evil age, there is a verse that deals with arrogant members of the Buddhist clergy. Third, in the section on the forest-dwelling monks, there are 3 verses dealing with members of the clergy who pretend to be sages and use their position to act as leaders of all the other evil persons." End quote. And the same text goes on to say, quote, "The section that begins, 'Constantly they will go about among the populace,' describes how these men will appeal to the government authorities, slandering the law and defaming its supporters." End quote. In the 9th volume of the Nirvana Sutra, we read, quote, "Men of devout faith, there are persons called Ikchantika, persons of incorrigible disbelief. They pretend to be arhats, living in deserted places and speaking slanderously of the Mahayana Sutras. When ordinary people see them, they suppose that they are all true arhats and speak of them as great bodhisattvas." End quote. It also says, quote, "At that time, this sutra will be preached throughout the continent of Jambudvipa. In the age, there will be evil monks who will do violence to the sutra and destroy its unity, losing the color, scent, and flavor of the true law that it contains. These evil men will read and recite the sutra, but they will ignore and put aside the profound and vital principles that the Buddha has expounded in it and replace them with ornate rhetoric and meaningless talk. They will tear off the first part of the sutra and stick it on the end, tear off the end and put it at the beginning, put the end and the beginning in the middle, and the middle at the beginning or the end. You must understand that these evil monks are the companions of the devil." End quote. The 6th volume Hatsunayon Sutra states, quote, "There are also Ekchantika who resemble arhats but who commit evil deeds. There are also arhats who resemble Ekchantika but display merciful hearts. The Ekchantika who look like arhats spend their time slandering the Mahayana Sutras to the populace. The arhats who look like Ekchantika, on the other hand, are critical of the Shoman and go about preaching Mahayana doctrines. They address the populace, saying, 'You and I are bodhisattvas.' Why? Because each and every one of us possesses the Buddha nature. But the populace will probably call such men Ekchantika." End quote. In the Nirvana Sutra, the Buddha speaks as follows, quote, "After I have passed away, and after the former day of the law has ended and the middle day of the law has begun, there will be monks who will give the appearance of abiding by the rules of monastic discipline. But they will scarcely ever read or recite the sutras, and instead will crave all kinds of food and drink to nourish their bodies. Though they will wear the robes of a monk, they will go about searching for alms like so many huntsmen, spying sharply and stalking softly. They will be like a cat on the prowl for mice, and constantly they will reiterate these words, 'I have attained the state of arhat.' Outwardly, they will seem to be wise and good, but within they will harbor greed and jealousy. And when they are asked to preach the Dharma, they will conceal it, like Brahmins who have taken the vow of silence. They are not true monks. They merely have the appearance of monks. Consumed by their erroneous views, they slander the true law." End quote. In the light of the sun and moon that are the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras, or in the bright mirrors that are the writings of Miao Lo and Chi Tu, we can discern without a trace of doubt the ugly faces of the people of Zen, Ritsu, and Nembutsu in present-day Japan. The Kanji chapter of the Lotus Sutra says, quote, "After the Buddha has passed away in an age of fear and evil," end quote. And the Anrakugyo chapter says, quote, "In the evil age hereafter, in the latter age, and in the latter age when the law is on the point of disappearing," end quote. The Fumbetsu Kudoku chapter says, quote, "In the evil-filled latter day of the law," end quote. The Yakuo chapter says, quote, "In the 5th 500 years," end quote, etc. The Kanzetsu chapter of the Dharmaraksha translation of the Lotus Sutra says, "In the latter age," and "in the latter age to come." The same type of language is found in the translation of the Lotus Sutra made by Jnanagupta and Dharmagupta. Tiantai states, quote, "In the middle day of the law, the 3 sects of southern China and the 7 sects of northern China are the enemies of the Lotus Sutra," end quote. And Dengyo states, quote, "At the end of the middle day of the law, the scholars of the 6 Nara sects are the enemies of the Lotus Sutra," end quote. In the time of Tiantai and Dengyo, the 3 types of enemies mentioned above had not yet appeared. But we must recall that when Shakyamuni Buddha and Taho Buddha sat side by side in the treasure tower, like the sun and the moon, and the Buddhas who were emanations of Shakyamuni had come from the 10 directions and were ranged beneath the trees like so many stars, then it was said that after the 1,000 years of the former day of the law and the 1,000 years of the middle day of the law, at the beginning of the latter day of the law, there would be 3 types of enemies of the Lotus Sutra. How could this pronouncement made by the 80 myriads of millions of Nayutas of Bodhisattvas have been an empty or false prediction? It is now some 2,200 years since the Buddha passed away. Even if it were possible to point straight to the earth and miss it, if the flowers were to cease blooming in spring, still I am certain that these 3 powerful enemies are bound to appear in the land of Japan. If so, then who is to be numbered among the 3 enemies? And who is to be accounted a votary of the Lotus Sutra? It is a troubling question. Are we, I and my disciples, to be numbered among the 3 enemies? Or are we to be numbered among the votaries of the Lotus Sutra? It is a troubling question. In the 24th year of the reign of King Chao, the 4th ruler of the Zhou dynasty in ancient China, traditional date around 1028 BC, on the night of the 8th day of the 4th month, a 5-colored light spread across the sky from north to south until all was as bright as noon. The earth shook in 6 different ways, and though no rain fell, the rivers and streams, wells and ponds overflowed with water. All the trees and grasses bloomed and bore fruit. It was a wondrous happening indeed. King Chao was greatly alarmed, but the grand historian Su Yu performed divinations and announced, "A great sage has been born in the western region." "What will become of our country?" asked King Chao, to which Su Yu replied, "It will suffer no harm. 1,000 years from now, the words of this sage will be brought to this country and will bring benefit to all living beings." Su Yu was a scholar of non-Buddhist texts who had not in the slightest degree freed himself from illusions, and yet he was able to know what would happen 1,000 years in the future. And just as he predicted, 1,015 years after the Buddha's passing, in the reign of Emperor Ming, the 2nd ruler of the later Han Dynasty, in the 10th year of the Yunping era, at 67 AD, the doctrines of Buddhism were introduced to China. On quite a different level is the prediction I have described above that was made by the various bodhisattvas in the presence of Shakyamuni Buddha, Taho Buddha, and the Buddhas from the 10 directions that were emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha. In view of this prediction, how could the 3 types of enemies of the Lotus Sutra help but be present in Japan today? In the Fuhozo Sutra, the Buddha is recorded as saying, quote, "After my passing, during the 1,000 years of the former day of the law, there will be 24 persons in succession who will spread about the true law as I have taught it," end quote. Mahakasyapa and Ananda were contemporaries of the Buddha, and so we will pass them over. But 100 years later, there was a monk Parshva. 600 years later, the Bodhisattva Ashvaghosha, and 700 years later, the Bodhisattva Nagarjuna, along with others, all appearing just as the prophecy had said they would. If so, how could the prophecy in the Kanji chapter of the Lotus Sutra be in vain? If this prophecy is at variance with the truth, then the whole Lotus Sutra is at variance with the truth. Then the prediction that Shariputra will in the future become the flower-light Buddha, and that Mahakasyapa will become the light-bright Buddha, are all mere lies. In that case, the teachings put forward in the sutras that preceded the Lotus Sutra must be correct, and Shariputra and the other Shoman are destined to never achieve Buddhahood. If it is true that one should give alms to a dog or a jackal before one gives them to Shoman such as Ananda, then where do we stand? In the passage from the Kanji chapter of the Lotus Sutra that I quoted earlier, the text mentioned 3 groups of people, saying first that there will be many ignorant people, referring second to monks in that evil age, and third to monks in their clothing of patched rags. The first category of ignorant people are the important lay believers who support monks in the second and third categories. Accordingly, the great teacher Miao Lo, commenting on the persons in the first group, says they represent the arrogance and presumptions of the ordinary populace. And the priest Chi Tu describes how they will appeal to the government authorities and their slanders of the law and its supporters. Concerning the second group of enemies of the Lotus Sutra, the sutra says, there will be monks in that evil age with perverse views and hearts that are fawning and crooked who will say that they have attained what they have not attained, being proud and boastful in heart. Similarly, the Nirvana Sutra says in that age there will be evil monks. These evil men will read and recite the sutra, but they will ignore and put aside the profound and vital principles that the Buddha has expounded in it. The Makashakan says, quote, "If one lacks faith in the Lotus Sutra, he will object that it pertains to the lofty realm of the sages, something far beyond the capacity of his own wisdom to comprehend. If one lacks wisdom, he will become puffed up with arrogance and will claim to be equal of the Buddha." We see an example of this in the statement made by the priest Tao Cho. Quote, "The second reason for rejecting the Lotus Sutra is that its principles are so profound that few can comprehend them," end quote. In a similar vein, Honen says, quote, "Religious practices other than the Nembutsu do not accord with people's capacities. They are not appropriate for the times," end quote. To combat such views, Miao Lo states in the 10th volume of his Hokkei Mongu Ki, quote, "Probably the reason people are mistaken in their understanding of this matter is that they fail to realize how great the benefit gained even by a beginner in the practice of the Lotus Sutra. They assume that benefit is reserved for those who are far advanced in practice and disparage the effort of beginners. Therefore, I will now demonstrate that even a little practice will gain profound benefit, and thereby show how great is the power of the Lotus Sutra," end quote. Similarly, the great teacher Dengyo declared, quote, "The former and middle days are almost over, and the latter day is near at hand. Now indeed is the time when the one vehicle expounded in the Lotus Sutra will prove how perfectly it fits the capacities of all people. How do we know this is true? Because the Anrakugyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra states that in the later age, when the law is on the point of disappearing, the Lotus Sutra will be expounded far and wide," end quote. And Eshin says, quote, "Through all Japan, all people share the same capacity to attain Buddhahood through the perfect teaching of the Lotus Sutra," end quote. Now which opinion should we believe? That of Tao Cho and Honen, or that of Dengyo and Eshin? The former has not a scrap of evidence in the sutras to support it, and the latter is based firmly on the Lotus Sutra. Moreover, the great teacher Dengyo of Mount Hiei is honored by priests throughout Japan as the master of ordination into priesthood. How could any priest turn their hearts towards a person like Honen, who is possessed by the devil of the sixth heaven, and reject the great teacher Dengyo, who established the very ordination ceremonies that these priests themselves underwent? If Honen was a truly wise man, why did he not, in his Senchakushu, mention the passages of explanation by Dengyo and Eshin, such as I have quoted above, and resolve the contradiction? He did not do so because he is the kind of person who hides the teachings of others. When the Lotus Sutra speaks of the second type of enemy, monks of that evil age, it is referring to men like Honen who disregard the precepts and hold perverse views. The Nirvana Sutra says, "We call ourselves men of perverse views." Miao Lo explains this by saying, quote, "The Buddha is referring to the 3 types of teachings that precede the Lotus Sutra and saying that they all may be called perverse views," end quote. Namakashakan states, quote, "The Nirvana Sutra says, until the time of the Lotus Sutra we call ourselves men of perverse views. Perverseness is bad, is it not?" End quote. In the Guketsu, Miao Lo states, quote, "Perverseness is bad. Therefore we must understand that only the perfect teachings, which reveal the truth, are good. But there are 2 meanings involved here. That which accords with the truth is to be accounted good, and that which goes against the truth is to be accounted bad. This is the meaning from the relative standpoint. At the same time, attachment is bad, and transcending it is good. From both the relative and absolute points of view, we should abandon all that is bad. To be attached to the perfect teachings of the 3 teachings that precede the Lotus Sutra is bad, and to be attached to the lower teachings is, of course, even worse. End quote. The goods and evils of the non-Buddhist creeds, when compared to the Hinayana Sutras, all represent a bad way. Similarly, the good ways expounded in the Hinayana Sutras and in the Sutras of the 4 inferior flavors and the 3 types of teachings, when compared with the Lotus Sutra, are all perverse and bad. The Lotus Sutra alone represents the true good. The perfection of the sutras preached before the Lotus Sutra is a relative perfection. Compared to absolute perfection, it must still be counted as bad. To hold fast to the 3 types of teachings expounded before the Lotus Sutra is still to follow a bad way. Even one who practices the highest principles taught in the sutras of that period is still following a bad way. How much more so, then, is someone who would take a work of insignificant doctrine such as the Kamaryoju Sutra, which cannot compare even with the Keigon and Hanya Sutras, and substitute it for the Lotus Sutra? Though such a person borrows ideas from the Lotus, he urges people to discard, close, ignore, and abandon the Lotus and devote themselves to the Nembutsu. That is what Honen and his disciples and lay supporters do, and they deserve to be called slanderers of the true law, do they not? The Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra says of the assemblies of Shakyamuni Buddha, Tahu Buddha, and the various Buddhas of the 10 directions, quote, "To make certain that the law will endure forever, they have come to this place." End quote. And yet Honen and the other practitioners of the Nembutsu in Japan declare that in the latter day of the law, the Lotus Sutra will disappear before the Nembutsu. Are such persons not the enemies of Shakyamuni, Taho, and the other Buddhas? Concerning the 3rd group of enemies of the Lotus Sutra, the sutra says, "Or there will be forest-dwelling monks wearing clothing of patched rags and living in retirement, and they will preach the Dharma to white-robed laymen, and will be respected and revered by the world as though they were arhats who possess the 6 supernatural powers." In the 6th volume, Hatsunairan Sutra states, "There are also Echantikas who resemble arhats but who commit evil deeds. There are also arhats who resemble Echantikas but display merciful hearts. The Echantikas who look like arhats spend their time slandering the Mahayana Sutras to the populace. The arhats who look like Echantika, on the other hand, are critical of the Shoman and go about preaching Mahayana doctrines. They address the populace saying, 'You and I are all bodhisattvas.' Why? Because each and every one of us possesses Buddha nature, but the populace will probably call such men Echantika." The Nirvana Sutra says, "After I have passed away, after the forward day of the law has ended and the middle day of the law has begun, there will be monks who will give the appearance of abiding by the rules of monastic discipline, but they will scarcely ever read or recite the sutras and instead will crave all kinds of food and drink to nourish their bodies. Though they wear the robes of a monk, they will go about searching for alms like so many huntsmen, spying sharply and stalking softly. They will be like a cat on the prowl for mice, and constantly they will reiterate these words, 'I have attained the state of arhat.' Outwardly they would seem to be wise and good, but within they will harbor greed and jealousy. And when they are asked to preach the Dharma, they will conceal it like Brahmins who have taken a vow of silence. They are not true monks. They merely have the appearance of monks. Consumed by their erroneous views, they slander the true law." Miyalo writes concerning persons of this type, quote, "The 3rd group is the most formidable of all. This is because the 2nd is harder to recognize for what it really is, and the 3rd is even harder to recognize," end quote. And the Toshun states, "Third, in the section of the forest-dwelling monks, there are 3 verses dealing with members of the clergy who pretend to be sages and use their position to act as leaders of all the other evil persons. And for these members of the clergy who pretend to be sages and use their positions to act as leaders of all the other evil persons, where in Japan at the present time should we look for them? On Mount Hiei? And on Joji Temple? In Toji Temple in Kyoto? In the temples of Nara? In the Zen Temple of Kininji in Kyoto? Or in the Zen temples Jufukuji and Kenchoji in Kamakura? We must examine this carefully. Do the words refer to the monks of Enryakuji on Mount Hiei who wear helmets on their heads and are dressed in armor? Do they refer to the monks of Onjoji who have consecrated their bodies to the Dharma and yet wear suits of mail and carry weapons? But these men do not resemble the forest-dwelling monks wearing clothing of patched rags and living in retirement that are described in the sutra. Nor do they seem to be the type who are respected and revered by the world as though they were arhats who possess the 6 supernatural powers. They are not like the men of the 3rd group who, Miyalo said, are even harder to recognize. It will appear, therefore, that the words refer to men such as Shoichi of Kyoto and Ryokan of Kamakura. Even if they are so denounced, it does not do to hate others. If one has eyes, one should examine the sutra text and compare one's behavior with them. The 1st volume of the Makashikan states, quote, "There has never been anything to compare to the brightness and serenity of Shikan-style meditation," end quote. In the 1st volume of the Guketsu, Miyalo writes, quote, "From the time when Emperor Ming of the Han Dynasty dreamt of the Buddha, down to the Cheng Dynasty when the great teacher Tiantai lived, there were many who participated in the Zen sect and received the robe and bowl that were handed down," end quote. The Fuchu explains this by saying, quote, "The handing down of the robe and bowl refers to the succession of Zen patriarchs from Bodhidharma on down," end quote. In Volume 5 of the Makashikan, Tiantai says, quote, "There's a type called Zen men, but their leaders and disciples are blind to the truth and lame in practice, and both leaders and disciples will fall into hell," end quote. In the 7th volume we read, quote, "I have set forth 10 ways to understand and propagate the Dharma, but the 9th way has nothing in common with the ordinary priests of this world who concentrate on the written word, nor does it have anything in common with the Zen masters who concentrate on practice. Some Zen masters give all their attention to meditation, which is one of the 10 ways in my system, but their meditation is shallow and false, totally lacking in the rest of the 10 ways. This is no empty assertion. Worthy men of later ages who have eyes to see will understand the truth of what I say," end quote. In the 7th volume of the Guketsu, Miao comments on this as follows, quote, "Priests who concentrate on the written word," refers to men who gain no inner sight or understanding through meditation but concern themselves only with the externals of the Dharma. Zen masters who give all their attention to meditation refers to men who do not learn how to attain the true realm and wisdom of meditation, but fix their minds on the mere techniques of breath control. They are incapable of cutting off the basic delusions. Some Zen masters give all their attention to meditation, which is one of the 10 ways, means that for the sake of discussion, Tiantai gives them a certain degree of recognition, but in the end he withdraws it, concluding that their meditation never leads to true understanding. The Zen men in the world today value only empty meditation and have no familiarity with doctrinal teachings. They put together the 8 wrong views and the 8 worldly desires and talk about the Buddha as being 16 feet in height. They lump together the 5 components and the 3 poisons and call them the 8 wrong views. They equate the 6 sense organs with the 6 supernatural powers and the 4 elements with the 4 noble truths. To interpret the sutras in such an arbitrary manner is to be guilty of the great falsehood. Such nonsense is not even worth discussing," end quote. The 7th volume of the Makashikan states, quote, "In the past, the Zen master Bodhidharma of Ye and Lo became renowned throughout the length and breadth of China. When he arrived, people gathered around him from all directions like clouds, and when he left for another place, they formed crowds along the roads. But what profit did they derive from all the bustle and excitement? All of them regretted what they had done when they were on their deathbed," end quote. In the 7th volume of the Guketsu, Miao comments, quote, "The text speaks of the Zen master of Ye and Lo. Ye is in Xiangchao, and was the capital of the Qi and Wei dynasties. Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen, caused Buddhism to flourish there and converted the people of the region. The great teacher Tiantai, out of deference to the people of his time, refrains from naming Bodhidharma specifically. Lo refers to the city of Luoyang," end quote. The 6th volume Hatsunairon Sutra says, quote, "The extreme is impossible to see. That is, the extremely evil deeds done by the Chantika are all but impossible to perceive," end quote. Or as Miao Lo has said, quote, "The third group is the most formidable of all. This is because the third is even harder to recognize," end quote. Those without eyes, those with only one eye, and those with distorted vision cannot see these 3 types of enemies of the Lotus Sutra who have appeared at the beginning of the latter day of the law, but those who have attained a portion of the Buddha eye can see who they are. Quote, "They will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and great patrons of Buddhism," end quote, says the Kanji chapter. The priest Chitu comments in his Choshun, quote, "These men will appeal to the government authorities, slandering the law and defaming its supporters," end quote. In the past, when the middle day of the law was coming to an end, Gomyo, Shuin, and other monks presented petitions to the throne in which they slandered the great teacher Denyo. Now, at the beginning of the latter day of the law, Ryokan, Nen-a, and others drew up false documents and presented them to the shogunate. Are they not to be counted among the third group of enemies of the Lotus Sutra? Nowadays, the followers of the Nembutsu address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and great patrons of Buddhism who support the Tendai sect, saying, "The doctrines of the Lotus Sutra are so profound that we can barely comprehend them. The Dharma it teaches is extremely deep. Our capabilities are extremely shallow." Just as the Makashikan says, they object that it pertains to the lofty realm of the sages, something far beyond the capacity of their own wisdom to comprehend. Again, the men of the Zen sect say the Lotus Sutra is a finger pointing at the moon, but the Zen sect is the moon itself. Once one has the moon, of what use is the finger? Zen is the mind of the Buddha. The Lotus Sutra is the word of the Buddha. After the Buddha has finished preaching the Lotus Sutra and all the other sutras, he took a single flower and gave it to Mahakasyapa alone, whereby the disciple understood its meaning. As a symbol of this tacit communication, he also presented Mahakasyapa with his own robe, which had been handed down from one to another by the 28 patriarchs of Indian Zen, and so on to the 6th patriarch of Chinese Zen. For many years now, the whole country has been intoxicated and deceived by this kind of absurd nonsense. Again, the eminent monks of the Tendai and Shingon sects, though nominally representative of their respective sects, are in fact quite ignorant of their teachings. In the depths of their greed and out of fear of the courtiers and warriors, they lend their support to the assertions of the Nembutsu and Zen followers and sing their praises. Long ago, Taho Buddha and the various Buddhas who are emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha acknowledged their allegiance to the Lotus Sutra, saying, "We will make certain that the law will long endure." But now the eminent leaders of the Tendai sect obsequiously testify that the doctrines of the Lotus Sutra are so profound that one can barely comprehend them. As a result, the Lotus Sutra exists in Japan in name only. There is not a single person who actually practices it and attains enlightenment. Who can be called a votary of the Lotus Sutra? We see monks who burn down temples and pagodas and are exiled in numbers too great to count. And we see numerous eminent monks who fawn over the courtiers and warriors and are hated for it by the people. Can men such as these be called the votaries of the Lotus Sutra? Because the predictions of the Buddha are not false, the country is already full of the 3 types of enemies of the Lotus Sutra. And yet, as though to belie the golden words of the Buddha, there seems to be no votary of the Lotus Sutra as was predicted would appear. How can this be? But let us consider, who is it who is cursed and spoken ill of by the populace? Who is the monk who is attacked with swords and staves? Who is the monk who, because of the Lotus Sutra, is accused in petitions submitted to the courtiers and warriors? Who is the monk who is again and again banished, as the Lotus Sutra predicted? Who else in Japan besides Nichiren could fit this description? But I, Nichiren, am not a votary of the Lotus Sutra because, contrary to the prediction, heaven has cast me aside. Who then, in this present age, will be the votary of the Lotus Sutra and fulfill the prophecy of the Buddha? The Buddha and Devadatta are like form in its shadow. In lifetime after lifetime, they are never separated. Prince Shotoku and his archenemy Mononobe no Moriya appeared at the same time, like the blossom and the seed pod of the lotus. If there exists a votary of the Lotus Sutra, then the 3 types of enemies are bound to exist as well. The 3 types of enemies have already appeared. Who then is the votary of the Lotus Sutra? Let us seek him out and make him our teacher. As the Lotus Sutra says, to find such a person is as rare as for a one-eyed turtle to chance upon a piece of driftwood with a hole just the right size to hold him. Question. It would surely appear that the 3 types of enemies are present today, but there is no votary of the Lotus Sutra. If I were to say that you are the votary of the Lotus Sutra, then the following serious discrepancies would become apparent. The Anrakugyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra says, the young sons of the heavenly deities will wait on and serve him, swords and staves will not touch him, and poison will have no power to harm him. And the same passage continues, if men curse and speak evil of him, their mouths will be closed and stopped up. The Yakusoyu chapter says, they who have heard the law will enjoy peace and security in this life and good circumstances in the next. The Dharani chapter says that those who do harm to a votary of the Lotus Sutra will have their head split into 7 pieces like the branches of the Arijaka tree. Also, the Kambotsu chapter says, he who honors the Lotus Sutra will receive his reward of good fortune in the present age, and it adds that if anyone shall see a person who embraces this sutra and try to expose the faults or evils of that person, he will, in the present age, be afflicted with white leprosy, whether what he speaks is the truth or not. How do you explain these discrepancies? Answer. These doubts of yours are most opportune. I will take the occasion to clear up the points that puzzle you. The Fukyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra says Bodhisattva Fukyo was spoken evil of and cursed. And again, they would beat him with sticks and staves and stone him with rocks and tiles. The Nirvana Sutra says they will be killed or harmed. The Hoshi chapter of the Lotus Sutra states, hatred and jealousy abound even during the lifetime of the Buddha. The Buddha encountered acts of hostility known as the 9 great persecutions, such as being wounded in the foot by Devadatta, and yet he was a votary of the Lotus Sutra, was he not? And Bodhisattva Fukyo, who, as we have seen above, was cursed and beaten, was he not a votary of the one vehicle of the Lotus Sutra? Maudgalyayana was beaten to death by a Brahmin called Chikujo, literally meaning bamboo staff, some time after the Lotus Sutra predicted that he would attain Buddhahood in a future life. Bodhisattva Kanadeva was the 14th patriarch in the lineage of Buddhism in India, and Arya Sinha was the 25th patriarch, and both men were murdered. Were these men not votaries of the Lotus Sutra? The Chinese monk Chu Taoshang was banished to Mount Su, and the monk Fa Tao was branded on the face and exiled south of the Yangtze River. Were these men not upholders of the one vehicle of the Lotus Sutra? Among scholars of secular learning, both Po Chu-i and Sugawara no Michizane, who was posthumously revered as the god Tenjin of Kitano, were exiled to distant places. And yet, were they not worthy men? If we consider the meaning of these examples, we must note the following points. Those who did not commit the error of slandering the Lotus Sutra in their previous existences will become votaries of the Lotus Sutra in their present lives. If such persons should be subjected to persecution under a false charge of having committed worldly offenses, then those who persecute them ought to suffer some kind of immediate retribution. It should be like the case of the Ashuras who shoot arrows at Taishaku or the Garuda birds who try to eat the dragon kings of the icy lake, but who both invariably suffer injury themselves instead. And yet the great teacher Tiantai says, quote, the ills and pains I suffer at present are all due to causes in the past, and the meritorious deeds that I do in my present life will be rewarded in the future, end quote. Likewise, The Shinjikan Sutra states, quote, "If you want to understand the causes that existed in the past, look at the results as they are manifested in the present. And if you want to understand what results will be manifested in the future, look at the causes that exist in the present," end quote. The Fukyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra says, quote, "After expiating his sins," end quote. This indicates that Bodhisattva Fukyo was attacked with tiles and stones because he had in the past committed the offense of slandering the Lotus Sutra. Second, we should note that if a person is inevitably destined to fall into hell in his next existence, then even though he commits a grave offense in this life, he will suffer no immediate punishment. The Ikchantika, men of incorrigible disbelief, are examples of this. The Nirvana Sutra states, quote, "Bodhisattva Kasho said to the Buddha, 'World-honored one, as you have described, the rays of the Buddha's great nirvana enter the pores of all beings,' end quote. It also states, quote, "Bodhisattva Kasho said to the Buddha, 'World-honored one, how can those who have not yet set their hearts on enlightenment create the causes that will lead to enlightenment?' End quote. The sutra answered the questions this way. Quote, "The Buddha said to Kasho, there may be persons who listen to the Nirvana Sutra and yet claim that they have no need to set their heart on enlightenment, and instead slander the true law. Such persons will immediately dream at night of devils and their hearts will be filled with terror. The devils will say to them, 'How foolish you are, my friend. If you do not set your heart on enlightenment now, your lifespan will be cut short.' These persons quake in fear, and as soon as they wake from the dream, they set their hearts on enlightenment. And you should know that such persons will be great bodhisattvas." End quote. In other words, although a person might slander the true law, if he is not an unspeakably evil person, he will be warned at once in a dream and will have a change of heart. The Ikchantika, on the other hand, are likened to dead trees or stony mountains that can never bring forth growth. They are scorched seeds which, although they encounter the sweet rain, will not grow. They are bright pearls hidden in mud which can never shine. They are like persons with a wound on their hand who nevertheless handle poison. Just as torrents of rain cannot remain suspended in the sky, so will they fall into hell. All these various similes illustrate the fact that Ikchantika of the most evil type will invariably fall into the hell of incessant suffering at the time of their successive rebirths. Therefore, they do not suffer any immediate punishment in this life. They are like the evil rulers of ancient China, Emperor Qi of the Xia dynasty and Emperor Chou of the Yin dynasty. During their reigns, heaven did not display any unusual manifestations as a warning. That was because their offenses were so grave that their dynasties were already destined to perish. Third, it would appear that the guardian deities have deserted this country, and that is probably one reason why offenders do not suffer any immediate punishment. In an age that slanders the law, guardian deities will take their leave and the various heavenly gods will cease to lend their protection. That is why the votaries of the true law do not receive any sign of divine favor, but on the contrary encounter severe difficulties. The Konko Myo Sutra says, quote, "Those who perform good deeds day by day languish and dwindle in number," end quote. We are living in an evil country and an evil age. I have discussed all of this in detail in my work entitled Risho Ankokuron. This I will state, let the gods forsake me, let all persecutions assail me. Still I will give my life for the sake of the law. Shariputra practiced the way of the Bodhisattva for 60 eons, but he fell from the high position because he could not endure the beratings of the Brahmin who begged for his eye. Of those who received the seeds of Buddhahood in the time of Goyaku Jintingo, or in the days of the Daitsu Buddha, Sanzen Jintingo, many in later times abandoned the seeds, fell from their high condition, and remained in hell because they followed evil companions. Whether tempted by good or threatened by evil, if one casts aside the Lotus Sutra, he destines himself for hell. Here I will make a great vow. Though I might be offered the rulership of Japan if I will only abandon the Lotus Sutra, accept the teachings of the Kamryoju Sutra, and look forward to rebirth in the Western Pure Land, though I might be told that my father and mother will have their heads cut off if I do not recite the Nembutsu. Whatever obstacles I might encounter, so long as men of wisdom do not prove my teachings to be false, I will never accept the practices of the other sects. All other troubles are no more to me than dust before the wind. I will be the pillar of Japan. I will be the eyes of Japan. I will be the great ship of Japan. This is my vow, and I will never forsake it. Question. How can you be certain that the exiles and sentences of death imposed on you are the result of karma created in the past? Answer. A bronze mirror will reflect color and form. The first emperor of the Qin dynasty had a lie-detecting mirror that would reveal offenses committed in the present life. And the mirror of the Buddha's law makes clear the causal actions committed in the past. The Hatsunayon Sutra states, quote, "Men of devout faith, because you committed countless offenses and accumulated much evil karma in the past, you must expect to suffer retribution for everything you have done. You may be reviled, cursed with an ugly appearance, be poorly clad and poorly fed, seek wealth in vain, be born to an impoverished or heretical family, or be persecuted by your sovereign. It is due to the blessings obtained by protecting the law that one can diminish in this lifetime his suffering and retribution," end quote. This sutra passage conforms exactly to my own experience. By now, all the doubts I have raised earlier should be dispelled, and thousands of difficulties are nothing to me. But let me show you phrase by phrase how the text applies to me. You may be reviled, or as the Lotus Sutra says, they will despise, hate, envy, and bear grudges against you. And in exactly that manner I have been treated with contempt and arrogance for over 20 years. You will be cursed with an ugly appearance. You will be poorly clad. These too apply to me. You will be poorly fed. That applies to me. You will seek wealth in vain. That applies to me. You will be born to an impoverished family. That applies to me. You will be persecuted by your sovereign. That applies to me. The Lotus Sutra says again and again you will be banished. And the passage from the Hatsunayon Sutra speaks of having to suffer various kinds of retribution. Can there be any doubt that this passage applies to me? The passage also says, quote, it is due to the blessings obtained by protecting the law that one can diminish in this lifetime his suffering and retribution, end quote. The 5th volume of the Makashakan has this to say on the subject. Quote, the feeble merits produced by a mind only half intent on goodness cannot alter the cycle of birth and death. But if one practices meditation and attains profound insight, shikan, so as to control the 5 components of his life and thus ward off illness and restrain earthly desires, then one can transcend the cycle of birth and death, end quote. It also says, quote, as practice progresses and understanding grows, the 3 obstacles and 4 devils emerge, vying with one another to interfere, end quote. From the beginning this past, I have been born countless times as an evil ruler who deprived the votaries of the Lotus Sutra of their robes and rations, their fields and crops, much as the people of Japan in the present day go about destroying the temples dedicated to the Lotus Sutra. In addition, I cut off the heads of numberless votaries of the Lotus Sutra. Some of these grave offenses I have already paid for, but there must be some that are not paid for yet. Even if I seem to have paid for them all, there are still ill effects that remain. When the time comes for me to transcend the sufferings of birth and death and attain Buddhahood, it will only be after I have completely freed myself from these grave offenses. My merits are insignificant, but these offenses are grave. If I practiced the teachings of the Provisional Sutras rather than those of the Lotus Sutra, then these retributions for my past grave offenses will not appear. When iron is heated, if it is not strenuously forged, the impurities in it will not become apparent. Only when it is subjected to the tempering process again and again will the flaws appear. When one is pressing hemp seeds, if he does not press very hard, he will not get much oil from them. Likewise, when I vigorously berate those throughout the country who slander the law, I meet with great difficulties. It must be that my actions in defending the law in this present life are calling forth retribution for the grave offenses of my past. If iron does not come into contact with fire, it remains black. But if it contacts fire, it turns red. If you place a log across a swift stream, waves will pile up like hills. If you disturb a sleeping lion, it will roar loudly. The Nirvana Sutra says, quote, it is like the case of a poor woman. She has no house to live in and no one to aid or protect her. And in addition, she is beset by illness, hunger, and thirst until she decides to take to the road and beg for a living. While staying at the house of another, she gives birth to a baby, but the master of the house drives her away. Though the baby has just been born, she takes it up in her arms and sets out, hoping to journey to another land. But along the way, she encounters fierce wind and rain, and she is troubled by cold and bitten by mosquitoes, hornets, and poisonous insects. Coming at length to the Ganges River, she clasps her child in her arms and begins to cross it. Although the current is very swift, she will not let go of her child, and in the end, both mother and child are drowned. But through the merit that the woman gained by her loving tenderness, she is reborn after her death in the Brahma heaven. Monju. If there are men of devout faith who wish to defend the true law, they should emulate this poor woman crossing the Ganges who sacrificed her life because of her love for her child. Men of devout faith. The bodhisattvas who guard the law should behave in this way. Do not hesitate to give up your life. Then, although you do not seek enlightenment, enlightenment will come of itself, just as the poor woman, though she did not seek to be reborn in the Brahma heaven, was nevertheless reborn there. End quote. The great teacher Chang'an interprets this story from the Nirvana Sutra in terms of the 3 obstacles of illusion, karma, and retribution. Let us see how he does this. The fact that the woman is called poor indicates that the person does not have the treasure of the law. The fact that she is identified as a woman indicates that the person has a measure of tenderness. The house of another signifies a realm of defilement. The child she bears is the heart that has faith in the Lotus Sutra, one of the 3 factors leading to enlightenment. Being driven out of the house signifies that the person is exiled. The fact that the baby has just been born means that very little time has passed since the person began to have faith in the Lotus Sutra. The fierce wind the woman encounters is the imperial decree sentencing the person to exile. The mosquitoes and other insects are the many ignorant people who curse and speak ill of the votary of the Lotus Sutra. The fact that both mother and child are drowned indicates that, though in the end the person had his head cut off, he never renounced his faith in the Lotus Sutra. Being reborn in the Brahma heaven means being reborn in the realm of Buddhahood. The power of karmic reward extends to all of the 10 worlds, even to the realm of Buddhahood. Even though one might go around killing people in Japan, China, and other countries, if he does not commit any of the 5 cardinal sins or does not slander the law, he will not fall into the hell of incessant suffering. Yet he will be reborn and confined in the other kinds of hell over a period of countless years. Even if one observes a great many rules of discipline and performs a great many good acts, if he performs them with a mind only half intent on goodness, he cannot be reborn in heaven, in the world of form where beings are free from desires. To be born a king in the Brahma heaven, one must add compassion to the karmic reward that leads to rebirth in the threefold world. The poor woman in the sutra passage was reborn in the Brahma heaven because of her concern for her child. Her case is different from the ordinary rules of Buddhist practice. Chang'an offers 2 interpretations of this, but in the end it is nothing other than the loving kindness with which the woman cares for her child that makes the difference. Her concern concentrates on one thing, rather like a concentrated meditation of Buddhism. She thinks of nothing but her child, which is similar to the Buddha's profound mercy. That must be why, although she created no other causes to bring it about, she was reborn in the Brahma heaven. The path to Buddhahood is not to be found in the Kegon doctrine that the mind is the only reality, and the eightfold negation of the Sanran sect, in the consciousness-only doctrine of the Hosso sect, or in the Shingon type of meditation on the 5 elements of the universe. Only the Tendai doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen is the path to Buddhahood. Even in the case of this doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen, we do not possess the kind of wisdom and understanding to comprehend it fully. Nevertheless, among all the sutras preached by the Buddha during his lifetime, the Lotus Sutra alone contains this jewel, which is the doctrine of Ichinen Sanzen. The doctrines of the other sutras are merely yellow stones that appear to be jewels. They are like sand from which you can extract no oil no matter how hard you squeeze it, or a barren woman who can never bear a child. Even a wise man cannot become a Buddha through the other sutras, but with the Lotus Sutra, even fools can plant the seeds that lead to Buddhahood. As the sutra passage I have quoted earlier puts it, although you do not seek enlightenment, enlightenment will come of itself. Although I and my disciples may encounter various difficulties, if we do not harbor doubt in our hearts, we will as a matter of course attain Buddhahood. Do not have doubt simply because heaven does not lend you protection. Do not be discouraged because you do not enjoy an easy and secure existence in this life. This is what I have taught my disciples morning and evening, and yet they begin to harbor doubts and abandon their faith. Foolish men are likely to forget the promises they have made when the crucial moment comes. In the face of persecutions, some of them feel pity for their wives and children and grieve at the thought of parting from them in this life. In countless births, throughout many long eons, they have had wives and children, but parted from them in every existence. They have done so unwillingly, and not because of their desire to pursue the way of the Buddha. Since they must part with them in any case, they should remain faithful to the belief in the Lotus Sutra and make their way to Eagle Peak so that they may lead their wives and children there as well. Question. You insist that the followers of the Nembutsu and Zen sects will fall into the hell of incessant suffering. This shows that you have a contentious heart. You yourself are in danger of falling into the realm of the Asuras. Moreover, it is said in the Anrakugyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra, quote, "It is undesirable that one should speak of the faults of others or of the other sutras, nor should one regard other priests with contempt." End quote. It is because you are going against this passage in the sutra that you have been abandoned by heaven, is it not? Answer. The Makashikan says, quote, "There are 2 ways to spread the Buddhist teachings. The first is called shoju, and the second is called shakubuku. When the Anrakugyo chapter says that one should not speak of the good or bad points of others, it is referring to the shoju method. But when the Nirvana Sutra says carry swords and staves and cut off their heads, it is referring to the shakubuku method. They differ in approach in that one is lenient and the other severe, but they both bring benefit." End quote. In the Guketsu, Miyaolo comments on this passage as follows, quote, "With regard to the 2 ways of spreading the Buddhist teachings, the Nirvana Sutra says carry swords and staves, and in the 3rd volume it says that defenders of the true law need not observe the 5 precepts or practice the rules of proper behavior. And later on it tells of how King Senyo put to death those who slandered the law. It also states the new physician, knowing that the medicine the people had been using was poison, forbade them to use it, saying, 'If anyone takes any more of this medicine, he will have his head cut off.' These passages all demonstrate how the method of shakubuku should be applied to persons who go against the law. All the sutras and treatises deal with one or the other of these 2 methods." End quote. In the Hokkemongu, Tiantai states, quote, "Question. The Nirvana Sutra clearly states that one should support and follow the ruler, bearing bows and arrows and helping to overthrow evil persons. And yet the Anrakugyo chapter of the Lotus Sutra says that one should stay away from persons in power and should behave with humility and loving kindness. There seems to be a major contradiction between the sternness of one approach and the gentleness of the other. Why should they differ so?" Answer. The Nirvana Sutra speaks mostly about the shakubuku approach, but it also mentions dwelling in the state where one looks on all beings as one's own children. Could it say so if it did not have the shoju approach? The Lotus Sutra is concerned mainly with the elucidation of the shoju approach, but in the Dharani chapter there is also a curse on anyone who offends the law, which says he will have his head split into 7 parts. Could it say so if it did not have the shakubuku approach? One should examine both methods and use whichever one accords with the time." End quote. Chang'an, in his commentary on the Nirvana Sutra, writes, quote, "When priests or laymen are defending the law, the most important thing is for them to adopt the proper basic mental attitude. They should disregard external details, stick to the principles, and in this way spread the teachings of the Nirvana Sutra. Therefore, it says that defenders of the true law need not abide by petty regulations. And that is why it says they need not practice the rules of proper behavior. In past times, the age was peaceful and the law spread throughout the country. At that time, it was proper to observe the 5 precepts and not to carry staves. But now the age is perilous and the law is overshadowed. Therefore, it is proper to carry staves and to disregard the 5 precepts. If both past and present were perilous times, then it would be proper to carry staves in both of them. And if both past and present were peaceful times, then it would be proper to observe the 5 precepts in both of them. You should distinguish between the shoju and the shakubuku method, and never adhere solely to one or the other." End quote. I suppose the learned priests of the time think it is only natural that one should have doubts about this. Therefore, no matter how I explain and try to persuade my own disciples, they still cannot seem to overcome their doubts, but behave like Ichantika, who do not possess the innate nature to become Buddhas. Therefore, I have quoted these passages of explanation from Tiantai, Miaodo, and others in order to silence their ungrounded criticisms. These 2 methods of spreading the law, shoju and shakubuku, are like fire and water. Fire hates water. Water detests fire. The practitioner of shoju laughs with scorn at shakubuku. The practitioner of shakubuku despairs at the thought of shoju. When the country is full of ignorant and evil persons, then shoju is the primary method to be applied, as described in the Anrakugyo chapter. But at a time when there are many persons of perverse views who slander the law, then shakubuku should come first, as described in the Fukyo chapter. It is like using cold water to cool yourself in the hot weather, or longing for a fire when the weather turns cold. Grass and trees are kinsmen to the sun. They suffer in the cold moonlight. Bodies of water are followers of the moon. They lose their true nature when the hot weather comes. In the latter day of the law, however, both shoju and shakubuku are to be used. This is because there are 2 kinds of countries: the country that is passively evil and the kind that actively seeks to destroy the law. We must consider carefully to which category Japan at the present time belongs. Question: if one applies the shakubuku method at a time when the shoju method would be appropriate, or shoju at a time when shakubuku would be appropriate, is there any merit to be gained? Answer: the Nirvana Sutra says, quote, "The Bodhisattva Kasho addressed the Buddha saying, 'The essential body of the law that you possess is as indestructible as a diamond, but I do not yet understand the means by which you acquired it. Would you tell me?' The Buddha replied, 'Kasho, it is because I was a defender of the true law that I am now able to attain this diamond-like body that abides forever and is never destroyed.' Men of devout faith, defenders of the true law need not observe the 5 precepts or practice the rules of proper behavior. Rather, they should carry knives and swords, bows and arrows. There are priests who preach the Dharma in various ways, yet still they are not able to utter the lion's roar, and refute evil persons who deny the Dharma. Priests of this kind can bring no merit either to themselves or to the populace. You should realize that they are in fact shirkers and idlers. Though they are careful in observing the precepts and maintain spotless conduct, you should realize that they are incapable of attaining Buddhahood. Then, at times, there are others who fail to observe the precepts, and as soon as they finish listening to the priest, are enraged to the point where they are about to attack him. Someone who preaches the Dharma in this way, though he may in the end lose his life, is still worthy of being called a person who observes the precepts and brings merit to both himself and others." End quote. Chang'an, in the passage quoted earlier, says, quote, "You should distinguish between the shoju and shakubuku methods and never adhere solely to one or the other." End quote. And Tiantai, as we have seen, declared that one should use whichever method accords with the time. If you do not, you will be like someone who plants seeds at the end of autumn. Though you may carefully tend the field, you are not likely to harvest any rice or grain. During the Kennin era, that's 1201 to 1204, 2 men came to prominence, Honen and Dainichi, who spread the teachings of the Nembutsu and Zen sects respectively. Honen denied the worth of the Lotus Sutra now that the world has entered the latter day of the law, saying, quote, "Not a single person has ever attained Buddhahood through the sutra," end quote, and, quote, "Not one person in 1,000 can reach enlightenment through its teachings," end quote. Dainichi, for his part, claimed that the true teachings of Buddhism have been transmitted apart from the sutras. These 2 doctrines have now spread throughout the entire country. The learned priests of the Tendai and Shingon sects fawn on the Nembutsu and Zen followers, or fear them the way a dog wags its tail before its master, or a mouse fears a cat. These men enter the service of the ruler and the military leaders, where they preach in such a way as to bring about the destruction of the Buddhist law and the ruin of the country. These Tendai and Shingon leaders, in their present existence, will fall into the realm of hunger, and after death they will find themselves in the hell of incessant suffering. Even if they retire to the mountain forest and meditate intensively on Ichinen Sanzen, or retire to a quiet spot and devote themselves to the 3 mysteries of body, mouth, and mind, If they do not understand the times or the people's capacity and perceive which of the two methods, shoju or shakubuku, is appropriate, then they can never free themselves from the sufferings of birth and death. Question: when you berate the followers of the Nembutsu and Zen sects and arouse their enmity, what merit does that bring? Answer: the Nirvana Sutra says, quote, if even a good priest sees someone slandering the law and disregards him, failing to reproach him, to oust him, or to punish him for his offense, then that priest is betraying Buddhism. But if he takes the slanderer severely to task, drives him off, or punishes him, then he is my disciple and one who truly understands my teachings. End quote. Chang'an comments on this as follows, quote, he who injures or brings confusion to the Buddhist law is an enemy of the law. If one befriends another person but lacks the mercy to correct him, he is in fact his enemy. But he who is willing to reprimand and correct the offender is one who truly understands and defends the law, a true disciple of the Buddha. He makes it possible for the offender to rid himself of evil, and thus he acts like a parent to the offender. Those who are willing to reproach offenders are disciples of the Buddha, but those who will not oust offenders are enemies of the Buddhist law. End quote. If we examine the Hoto chapter of the Lotus Sutra, we find Shakyamuni Buddha, Taho Buddha, and the various Buddhas from the 10 directions who are emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha gathering together. And why? As the sutra itself says, quote, to make certain that the law will long endure, they have come to this place. End quote. One may surmise from this that Shakyamuni, Taho, and the other Buddhas intend to ensure the future propagation of the Lotus Sutra so that it can be made available to every single living being in times to come. Their concern and compassion are even greater than that of a father and mother who see their only child inflicted with great suffering. Honen, however, shows not the least concern about their compassion, but would tightly shut the gates to the Lotus Sutra so that in the future no one would have access to it. Like a person who tricks a demented child into throwing away his treasure, he tries to induce people to discard the Lotus Sutra. A cruel-hearted thing to do indeed. If someone is about to kill your father and mother, wouldn't you try to warn them? If an evil son who is insane with drink is threatening to kill his father and mother, wouldn't you try to stop him? If some evil person is about to set fire to the temples and pagodas, shouldn't you try to stop him? If your only child is gravely ill, wouldn't you try to cure him with moxibustion treatment? To fail to do so is to act like those people who do not try to put a stop to the Zen and Nembutsu followers in Japan. As Chang'an says, if one befriends another person but lacks the mercy to correct him, he is in fact his enemy. I, Nichiren, am sovereign, teacher, father, and mother to all the people of Japan. But the men of the Tendai sect, who do not refute these heretical sects, are all great enemies of the people. As Chang'an has noted, quote, he who makes it possible for an offender to rid himself of evil is acting like a parent to him. End quote. He who has not set his heart upon the way can never free himself from the sufferings of birth and death. Shakyamuni was cursed by all the followers of the non-Buddhist teachings and labeled as a man of great evil. The great teacher Tiantai was regarded with intense enmity by the 3 Buddhist sects of southern China and the 7 sects of northern China, and later in Japan the Hosso monk Tokuichi criticized him for, quote, using his 3-inch tongue to try to destroy the 5-foot body of the Buddha, end quote. The great teacher Dengyo was disparaged by the monks of Nara who said, quote, that Saicho has never been to the capital of Tang China, end quote. But all of these abuses were incurred because of the Lotus Sutra, and they are therefore no shame to the men who suffered them. To be praised by fools, that is a great shame. Now that I have been exiled by the authorities, the priests of the Tendai and Shingon sects are no doubt delighted. They are strange and cruel-hearted men. Shakyamuni appeared in the Saha world, Kumarajiva journeyed to the Qin dynasty of China, and Dengyo likewise went to China, also that the Lotus Sutra might be preached and propagated. Bodhisattvas Kanadeva and Aryasinha sacrificed their bodies. Bodhisattva Yakuo burned his arms as an offering, and Prince Shotoku stripped off the skin on his arms to write the titles of sutras in blood. Shakyamuni, when he was a bodhisattva, sold his flesh to make offerings, and another time when he was a bodhisattva named Gyobo, he used his bone as a pen to write down the Dharma. Tiantai has said that the practice should accord with the time. The propagation of the Buddhist law does indeed follow the times. For what I have done, I have been condemned to exile. But it is a small suffering to undergo in this present life, and not one worth crying over. In future lives I will enjoy immense happiness, a thought that gives me great satisfaction. End of The Opening of the Eyes.